Nope. You can't ignore me forever, brother. Leave me alone, huh? I am the next Game of Thrones. You're not even the next Hobbit. Which Hobbit? What? Which Hobbit? There are like 3 of them. I don't know. Battle of 5 Armies. Come on, not even Desolation of Smaug? No, not even it doesn't matter. I'm leaving. I am the most expensive television show ever made. Money can't buy love. I want to make you my queen. This is the Lord of the Rings of the Lord of the Rings of the Power Rings of the Lord of the Rings.
Because an 8 out of 10.
I'm good.
An 8 out of 10.
Do you believe it?
Yeah.
The sea is always right.
I'm 8 out of 10.
And this video is only possible because of Jeffrey Nebula, and right now you can watch Lindsay Ellis's amazing documentary on how to actually adapt Lord of the Rings faithfully, wonderfully, beautifully at my link down the description, where they talk through Jackson's original trilogy and how to make good changes so you don't end up with... It's a fantastic video, and Nebula is a fantastic sponsor I can be genuinely excited to share with you guys for just a couple of bucks a month. I'm here to tell you that you were right, that I was right, that we were all right, that we all knew exactly what kind of show this was gonna be from the first moment it was announced, because this show is mediocre. Woo! It's underwhelming, it's a disappointment, but it's more bland and forgettable than it is terrible. If you're here to clap and cheer as I tear this botched surgery limb from limb, scene by scene, then you're gonna be sorely disappointed. Rings of Power is not the worst television show ever made, not the worst story ever written. It is not an abomination on such a colossal scale never seen before, not even close. There are plenty of shows as okay as this, telling you on something far more poisonous.
Guy Ladriel.
Rings of Power was a disappointment, but it was a disappointment in the worst way it could be. It's boring, it's just not that interesting, it's lackluster and it's clumsy at times. I like half of it half as well as I would like, and I like less than half of it half as well as it thinks it deserves. But it's also fine a lot of the time. There are some inspired creative decisions here and there, a lot of love and care was clearly put into the series. The Elrond Endurance storyline is full of heart, but all of this is lost inside a bland story, somehow both too ambitious and unambitious at the same time, undercut by forgettable characters and stakes which are hard to care about. The moments you know they want to resonate with you just don't.
Do you believe it? Do you believe it? I'm not.
You're never on the edge about what's gonna happen next. At least with truly terrible shows and films, you can have fun hate watching and laughing at them. You can enjoy them in this kind of masochistic way. Rings of Power is just not that. It was underwhelming on its own, regardless of whether or not you're a fan of Tolkien, with only 37% of people finishing season 1 at all, and when taken in the context of it costing Amazon $1 billion,
Billions and billions and
3 times as much as the next most expensive television show ever made, with a budget that could produce almost every single season of Game of Thrones combined, that disappointment sounds a lot like Jeff Bezos stepping down as CEO.
I've made billions of dollars of failures at Amazon.com.
You know what it is? It's frustrating. It gives us glimmers of what it could have been, but the rest of the time seems determined to be anything but that. Everything wrong with the series can be summed up in one question. Why would you tell the story this way? Why would you make your heartwarming Hobbit story about the brutal survivalist reality of leaving your friends behind to die in the wilderness? Why, if you want to tell the story of the rings and Sauron and Numenor, would you start with a largely irrelevant story structured this way? Why would you make the entire story so painfully slow for 7 episodes and then rush through the making of the Rings of Power? Not even kidding, and if this was all there was to say, I wouldn't be making a video. But there's not. It goes deeper. Because Rings of Power does tell us a fascinating story, just not the one it wants to. About two men's failed ambition, about corporate monopolization in a broken industry, about fandom meeting politics, and about a dark trend in media criticism we've seen on the rise in the last decade.
We interrupt this program to bring you
Guy Ladriel.
show.
Are you also worried about feminists ruining movies? Has your whining into the void still yielded no real change? Do you also just blatantly lie to sell people on your agenda?
Stupid!
Critic.
You made me look bad!
But it all starts with understanding what's wrong with this show. So fine, you want to know? Sit down, get a drink, and come along with me on an unexpected journey. Let's go. This might shock you, but just because something is badly written does not mean people won't enjoy it. Riverdale, Twilight, Ready Player One, Fast and Furious, Love Actually, Doctor Who, the 2011 sci-fi Fox TV show about escaping the end of the world by time traveling back to the time of the dinosaurs, Terra Nova. Just me? Nope. Rings of Power is not one of those stories. Stories which are bad, but for a lot of people are just really fun to be in. The reality is most people engage with media on one of two levels. This interests me. This bores me. And Rings of Power is the latter, best demonstrated in how the show handles mystery. There are basically 4 plot lines crammed into Rings of Power. There are the Harfoots, our discount hobbits who encounter a mysterious senile old man with a mystery over whether he's good or evil. Then there's the Southlands, where a kid discovers a mysterious cursed sword and some orcs, and they all have to worry about not being the meat back on the menu. Then there's Elrond and Durin, who are trying to get the elves and dwarves to work together on something, and then there's Galadriel, who starts off with Elrond, but then meets Halbrand and goes to Numenor over here to get an army to help the Southlands over here before coming back to Eregion and joining Elrond again, and she's very worried about where Sauron mysteriously might be. Fundamentally, the mysteries at the heart of these stories are either obvious, uninteresting, or both. The central one being, where is Sauron? Who is Sauron? I don't know. They present it like it could be old senile Sauron with the Harfoots, bootstrap Bill Sauron in the Southlands, or of course, hot sexy Sauron with Galadriel. Take your pick.
You can find me at the beach. Floaties on.
Weirdly, this mystery is more for the viewer than the characters. Like, nobody, not even Galadriel, is worried that Sauron might be in disguise right next to them at any time. And yet this is also clearly something Amazon wanted us thinking and tweeting about.
Tonight, one more trial awaits us.
You will be known at last for who you truly are, Lord Sauron.
The Rings of Power. New episode Fridays, only on Prime Video.
And they could literally see a fire streak across the sky and land. So that felt very climactic to us. And it also ends the pilot on a big question mark, because as you zoom out, you see this big flaming eye.
Yeah.
And you say, is this person who has just come Sauron? Or is he timed to coincide with the arrival of Sauron or counter Sauron? Or, how is he connected to Sauron? There's some kind of link somewhere or another.
Apparently, they thought Gil-galad was in the running. But good mysteries aren't just about the final revelation. In fact, they're even more about the journey, the series of revelations along the way which keep us engaged, on edge, complicating our questions and deepening our eventual answer. So, you might ask, how does the mystery of who our old, mysterious, senile, maybe Sauron stranger, how does that mystery progress? Well, in the very first episode, we see he's clearly magical and powerful, and the mystery is he good or evil? Find out next episode where we see that he's magical and powerful and looking for something, leading us to wonder, is he good or evil? We'll find out in the next episode where he sits with Nori and quite literally asks himself if he's good or evil.
I'm Perrin.
You're not a Perrin. You're good.
And they keep doing this every episode, the same question over and over until the finale when we finally get our answer and...
I'm good. Disappointed!
Okay. Anything else? Do we get his name? What's he here for? This mystery has virtually no deeper revelations, no developments to keep us interested along the way between the first and last episode, and that makes it feel slow, it makes it feel boring, especially when Rings of Power expects this mystery to keep us interested in the especially slower first few episodes. And it's even more egregious when you realize why they stretched it out like this. Narratively, it would have worked better to reveal this earlier and move on to a new chapter, and the writers seem to know this, because the stranger only gets 54 minutes of screen time, 70% of which is in his first 2 and last episodes when we finally get answers, with only 17 minutes screen time across episodes 4, 5, 6, and 7 in between, because the writers know there's just no real development here, nowhere they can go until they can reveal this mystery. Can, because they so clearly wanted to keep Old Senile around as a viable candidate for Sauron, right till the end, to fuel that mystery, even though this storyline didn't benefit from it. So its pacing is shot in the foot to keep this other mystery going, which it never interacts with anyway. These storylines never cross. There's just the question right at the start, is he good or evil, and then the answer right at the end, without much connective tissue in between. But there's also a structural issue with how they handled all of this, because episode 8 opens with these random cultist people announcing that the stranger here is Sauron, apparently.
What about second?
Sauron.
It's so obviously a bait and switch. It's so obviously not true because it's weirdly placed and kind of comes out of nowhere for something that the show has seemingly been building towards for 8 episodes. It's a scene only motivated by the desire to keep us from guessing Hellbrand, not because it actually helps this story. And they made the same lack of interesting developments mistake with another mystery in the show. What is the Mark of Sauron?
And marked his flesh with a symbol. One whose meaning even our wisest could not discern.
That mysterious music. This is meant to be the hook that gets us interested in the story in the first few minutes, but any interest we have in this question is squandered when Galadriel's plot takes a hard left turn away from it entirely. See, right after this, Galadriel immediately has to go all the way back home where she's sent away to Valinor for her disobedience, she gets shipwrecked and then ends up in Numenor by chance. She is not pursuing this hook in this time. This hook is basically set aside to go and do other stuff with no clues or progression in between until 2.5 hours later when we're just given the answer.
It is a map of the Southlands.
And it doesn't help that Galadriel doesn't really figure out the answer here. It's not a logical progression of us following along her character and ending up here at this point, this answer. The answer is handed to her here at just the right moment, quite literally. She accidentally ends up in Numenor, accidentally runs into the right person who has the information she seeks, and then it's handed to her in a translation someone else already did. The mystery was already solved, she just had to get here by chance. It doesn't help that a lot of people guessed it was a map of the Southlands, and that narratively, we already know the people in the Southlands are in danger. That's a whole storyline of its own. It's just question and answer with little progression or development in between for 2.5 hours. And it's also in moments like these, you can sort of feel the writer's hand in the script of, well, this needs to happen now because it needs to happen now. This is when Galadriel needs to figure this stuff out. Not necessarily because it naturally grew out of a path she chased. Blade Runner 2049, and yes, I will keep talking about this film because I love it. It's one of the best films ever made, but it's also a mystery at heart, and we can learn a few things from it. Over just a few hours, we learn Revelation 1, somehow, a replicant android had a baby. What? How? Who is it? Revelation 2. Kay, our protagonist, realizes his childhood memories he thought were fake might actually be real. Revelation 3. Our protagonist android Kay might actually be that baby who was born. Revelation 4. He's right. His memories are real, just like he thought. But they're actually not his. They were planted in his mind by someone else. Revelation 5, the real android kid is someone he met before, kept safe by an elaborate plan. The beautiful thing about this story is how every single twist and revelation profoundly alters our understanding of the characters and the story. It retrospectively alters our understanding of the stakes and their arcs. That retrospection, recontextualization, that deeper understanding keeps us engaged in thinking. None of the mysteries in Rings of Power really give us that level of development, of recontextualization or conclusion. Which wouldn't be a problem if it clearly wasn't relying on mystery to keep you engaged. But this is also where Rings of Power is kind of just okay, because even though there are some bad mysteries, The mystery of like the mithril or the cursed sword is mostly fine. They have some better progression, they have some tidbits along the way that keep you kind of guessing and interested in questioning, but they're never enough to make the whole story engaging. At most, they're just kind of fine. Like they're functional, they do what they're meant to do, but they're not that deep. But there's another half to any good mystery, a satisfying answer, one which makes sense of the evidence and pays off how much time we spent on it in the narrative with depth, even maybe making us rethink the story retrospectively. And Rings of Power, I need a drink here, fails at this even more. Because like, old senile being Sauron would be very strange given that whole storyline has virtually nothing to do with Galadriel, the one person really concerned about Sauron. Adar is already an antagonist and pretty quickly shown not to be Sauron, so Halbrand feels like our only viable option, and one of his opening lines is, I kid you not,
Looks can be deceiving.
putting aside the obvious foreshadowing if you know Tolkien's lore, because most people when they're watching this won't, and in 2021 there were massive leaks spoiling Halbrand's identity, this reveal was so predictable that Forbes writer Eric Kane wrote beforehand,
it would be ridiculously obvious and boneheaded to make Halbrand Sauron.
It's just the boring answer. It's the answer we didn't want because it's the first one that comes to mind, but they clearly want you to keep guessing anyway. It's getting Whoppers when you wanted Maltesers, and I say that because I tried Whoppers for the first time and holy crap, they were terrible. Halbrand is the lowest common denominator of boring answers, much like the reveal that the stranger is probably Gandalf, even if they haven't named him yet. At every turn, virtually any other answer for either of these characters would have been more interesting. A Balrog, a Ringwraith, the Witch King, one of the Blue Wizards. I'm still holding out for Alatar or Palando. Rings of Power has this other mystery of who are these people? I don't know. And they appeared significantly in the promotional material in the trailers, even though they have a collective screen time of about 14 minutes. And their big reveal is that they're from Run. Blah. Spooky. Don't really know anything about it. It's just an answer, which doesn't mean that much. What emotion does it inspire in you? Unlike with Halbrand, Theo's cursed sword turning out to be a key which unlocks a dam is not obvious. It is kind of interesting, but it's also kind of bizarre when you're led to think that the magical sword powered by blood is going to be something, I don't know, more? The sword is one of the better mysteries in the show. It's got some clues and developments along the way with an ending you mostly don't see coming. It ends in a volcanic eruption, but it still mostly just falls into that okay category, you know? I don't see myself rewatching Rings of Power to see how they pulled this mystery off. This mystery wrapped up in Theo's character. He's attracted to the blood and power of the sword. It never leads to him doing anything that interesting, and I'm not going to get into how much I hate Theo. He's just a little... And this is to say nothing of the other mysteries, which we get no progress or any answers on either, but they're also not enough to hook us and keep us engaged. They're just hanging questions. Like, you think about the best mysteries, and they're always finding answers and answers that lead to questions and questions lead to more answers, and it's layered and layered and layered. With Rings of Power, you mostly just get kind of like an answer, if that. But it does get worse because the Stranger and Sauron mysteries have these weird red herrings, clues which are intended to mislead us, and that's fine, that's part of mysteries, but sometimes it feels like the writers are almost lying to you to try and get you to second guess yourself, and not because it actually makes sense at the end. When the stranger lands in the opening episode in a crater of fire, and we're told the fire is not hot, which Galadriel says is a clear sign someone is incredibly evil.
This place is so evil, our torches give off no warmth.
Only the stranger isn't evil, never even does anything evil, and certainly doesn't want to be evil. He is accidentally destructive, but never evil. The struggle is never about him being drawn to it. This framing is pretty forced. The only reason the writers wanted us to think he's evil is so he could possibly be Sauron, not because it actually helps explain who he is when we look back and go, ah, of course, you know, ah. And again, we see how they're sacrificing the Halfwood storyline to make the Sauron mystery work, because you don't need the possibility of the stranger being evil to make the Halfwood storyline work. The story is so much more about whether the stranger can control his powers and avoid hurting his friends than him being drawn to evil. Good red herrings are distracting, but have better explanations once we have the full context, but we don't really get that here, not in a way that I found satisfying. Again, this story, which already feels too much like filler, is being gutted to make the Sauron mystery work. Two of the mysteries which did kind of work are Adar turning out to be one of the Mordiondur, a first age elf who has turned to help the orc, and the Mithril, which the dwarves have discovered. You know, we get some pretty quick progression with these. They don't drag them out, you know, like they do with the Stranger. The answers are proportional to the amount of time and narrative weight spent on them, but more importantly, they're built around characters we like and want to watch. Joseph Moore's Adar is fantastically played. He has this kind of age and wisdom and this I have seen things you have not kind of feel to him. And then there's Elrond and Durin and Disa, and they're just fun to watch. You know, the story that happens around them. The answers, in a sense, matter less than who they are happening to. Hence why Theo being involved is fucking weird. The showrunners have said that their story isn't meant to be about the big twist.
We're really not about the big twist, the big surprise, the big shocker, and that was never the goal here. I think we were much more interested in creating characters and relationships and dynamics that were engaging and hopefully emotionally rich and filled with conflict and hopefully delight and warmth.
But if that's the case, why make so much of the tension and marketing of Rings of Power dependent on that reveal? Why cripple one of your storylines to make it work? Why make it the climactic point of your story? And if Sauron isn't doing anything in the actual plot, he's not responsible for what we're seeing, why should we feel anything when he's actually revealed? You could say this is the point, that this twist is primarily done as a foil to Galadriel's character arc. If Sauron is capable of redemption, then maybe the orcs are too, and she shouldn't commit genocide. What a suggestion. This is actually not a terrible idea, and it does have its basis in some of Tolkien's theology and writings and philosophy, which we will get to. But why frame this as a mystery for us when Sauron really isn't responsible for anything presently in the story? You know, the reveal doesn't really hurt or excite or surprise. It doesn't even motivate Galadriel to do anything. It's shock and awe tactics minus the shock and awe. But this is also why doing Sauron the way they did is so baffling to me. In the lore, Sauron disguises himself to Celebrimbor and shows the elves how to make these magical rings that can help preserve their lands and themselves from decay. Kinda like the elves are concerned in the show. They only realize after they've made a bunch of rings, and the three included, who Sauron really is. The weird thing being, they could have done this exact story with Sauron trying to be good, and had the reveal that this is Sauron in a story where he has been doing things, where he is responsible for critical things in a plot that make us feel stuff. You can still have that, well, if Sauron can redeem himself, then perhaps anyone can. And it's even in the lore for Galadriel to kind of suss him out, and so we're left asking ourselves, why make the entire story about this dumb village in the Southlands nobody cares about, and then make your major plot twist that you pin a lot on have nothing to do with it? Rings of Power is simultaneously structured around the Hellbrand reveal, but not written to give it meaning. Boredom is like the house elf subplot in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. It's when you feel like nothing is happening and you want to skip past it. It's when the stranger's mystery doesn't progress, or when the reveals are either obvious or uninteresting, or it's when you're spending too much time with the Harfoots, or too much time in the Southlands, which is splintering about, or it's... Did I leave the fridge door open? Was Melanie coming over today? Sorry. Hey, Balrog! You like Balrogs? There you go. When you feel like nothing is happening, it's boredom. Whoa, look, writing 101. And Rings does have a problem with pacing. I can already hear you tippity-tappity typing down in the comments. Tolkien's writing is slow. It takes time to get you into it. That's the point, but it's good, and people these days are too impatient. You're right. You're absolutely right. Some of the best stories ever written are slow burns, including Fellowship of the Ring, The Sopranos, Pride and Prejudice, Hannibal, Blade Runner 2049. I'm sure you've got a slow burn one in your head right now. But listen to me, this is important. Slow pacing is not the same thing as bad pacing. And Rings of Power suffers from bad pacing. In fact, and you're not gonna believe me, but one of its most critical pacing issues is actually that it's too fast. Let me explain. God, how much more of this video do I have? Okay, take a look at this map of how Rings of Power spends its time. So we have 4 storylines, which all start in 4 different places with 4 different conflicts, different characters, mostly disconnected settings, meaning progressing all 4 at once is very hard and very slow. Moving Galadriel means the Southlands, Khazad-dûm, and the Halfwoods are frozen. Moving the Southlands mean Galadriel and Khazad-dûm and the Halfwoods are frozen, etc. The result of the structure is several episodes of setup without much payoff, even though you're spending hours doing this. And to make things worse, the Southlands plot actually splinters into more stories again, with Arondir, Bronwyn, and sometimes even Theo as well, having their own timelines. Nothing feels like it's happening in this show, because most of the time, virtually none of these characters are doing anything. In fact, I've got the numbers, I've got a study, I've got a published paper to prove I'm right here. This here is my experimental vision board, alright? Hypothesis! Rings of Power's divided narrative prevents us from getting as attached to these characters as we were to the ones in Lord of the Rings, alright? Evidence! The Lord of the Rings trilogy and Rings of Power have a virtually identical runtime at just over 9 hours, and yet, within the first 3 hours, the top 10 characters in terms of screen time in Lord of the Rings have had, and I need to run the numbers, triple the amount of time for us to get to know them and love them than the top 10 screen time characters in Rings of Power. And, by the way, that includes the One Ring as a character. And at the end of the full 9 hours, most of the characters in Rings of Power have only had as much screen time as Theoden. In fact, most of them have about 20 minutes less. And hey, I love Theoden, but he's clearly a secondary character. Even Galadriel, who has twice as much screen time as the next person, only has as much screen time as Pippin did. Conclusion, I'm right. Now, screen time does not necessarily mean we're going to be interested in characters, but it should reveal how structuring a story like this limits you and can exacerbate existing issues. Rings of Power necessarily has to spend more time establishing plot and context and conflict because there's more of it. They've got 4 storylines. And it's why the Elrond Durin storyline hits the hardest, because honestly, it doesn't spend a lot of time on plot. It's so much more just about their relationship. The plot, so to speak, doesn't actually really kick in until about halfway through the series. So right from the start, it's basically just Elrond and Durin vibing, and that matters. That's why we're attached to them. And this structural pacing problem is why so many fantasy epics start in the same way. Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, they begin with a branching narrative, a core set of characters in the same place, Winterfell or the Shire say, allowing us to get to know them as they all face the same conflicts together before branching off on their own stories once we know and love them. Like, Martin and Tolkien made this structural choice for a reason. It combats the problem of pacing in an epic, sprawling story of multiple threads that requires a lot of context. The context, most of it, comes later. And in all of these cases, there's an intimate sense that even once the plotlines do split off, they're influencing each other, helping the pacing of both. Daenerys is plotting her return to Westeros, Robert sends an assassin to kill her, Gandalf and Pippin are awaiting a siege in Gondor, Merry rides with the Rohirrim to their aid. This just isn't the case in Rings of Power. Elrond and Galadriel are together at the start, but it's just not enough. The Halfwoods are irrelevant to all of the other stories, and Eregion is only coincidentally and tangentially connected to Galadriel and the Southlands and Númenor, and the end result of this is that I'm drinking and bored. Ugh. And see, this also exposes a deeper structural issue because, hear me out, Rings of Power kinda doesn't have a first act. And not for a lack of trying. The first act is meant to drag us into the story by offering a hook, some interesting tension, a question we want the answer to. And oftentimes we watch or read on, not because we know or love the characters yet, but because we want answers. We want another clue, with the first act giving us breadcrumbs and small amounts of resolution to that hook, while promising a wider story. So in The Lord of the Rings, we are hooked in by the mystery of the One Ring. What is it? We learn what it truly is, that it must go to Rivendell, then tension as they're chased by these mysterious Black Riders. We learn what they are too, and Tolkien gives us a small amount of resolution to this hook and that final chase to Rivendell. It rewards our interest in the story, but sets the stage for an expanded narrative.
You shall be the Fellowship of the Ring.
Great.
Rings of Power does not do this. And this is not me saying that you have to use the 3-act structure because it's objectively the best writing or anything like that. Only that there are reasons that these structures exist and that we use them. And that Rings of Power does not offer anything better, and that they kind of are trying to do a first act but not really doing it well. Rings repeatedly introduces new hooks and new conflicts and new characters for 3 straight episodes rather than giving any interesting developments or resolution to the ones we already have. And to make it worse, the one major character and hook we have followed for most of the first 2 episodes, Galadriel, her story is basically set back to 0 in episode 3 with her arriving in Numenor, a whole new conflict, a whole new hook. It doesn't feel like her story naturally drives her here.
In time, they broke off all contact.
Why?
We may be about to find out.
There are very few developments or resolutions dragging us along with the story, and this goes on until the end of episode 5 when they finally leave for the Southlands. Kinda marking the end of the first act. You could say it's when Galadriel arrives in Numenor, but the first 2 episodes really don't offer much progress or resolution to any of our hooks. It doesn't have its own kind of internal rise and fall, its own arc. Numenor is honestly pretty disconnected from any of our story threads. There's no breadcrumb trail leading here. The change in setting on its own doesn't reward interest or set the stage for an expanded narrative. But what about Elrond and Durin? That's the best plotline, and you are right. And ironically, it actually doesn't have that strong a hook. It's basically, Celebrimbor wants to build a forge, blah. What really gets us into this storyline is Elrond and Durin's relationship, just exploring that, enjoying it, being around them and Deza, but it really only reaches a first act height in the middle of episode 4, again halfway through the series, and it's not enough to carry the entire show on its own, again, because of how divided the show's time is. Good pacing looks like rising and falling action to keep us engaged. Mini stories in their own, you can imagine them as. By the end of the 3rd hour of Fellowship, we've had a full arc, the rise, the tension, the fall, and the breaking of the Fellowship with the death of Boromir. And that's like the first act of the trilogy, but we also had a first act of the Hobbits getting to Rivendell. By the end of the 3rd hour of Rings of Power, we have,
Maybe he and the she-elf aren't so close after all. Wager she'd prefer someone of better breeding.
The Southlands is really the only storyline with a strong first act. We get the hook of these orcs building tunnels under the town, we get the pursuit of that, regular new revelations about it, and the promise of a wider story with the town migrating away to this fortress. On paper, great. In reality, God, I hate this storyline. I mean, first up, it's a bizarre decision to center the entire story of the first season around something that's largely irrelevant to the story that they clearly want to tell. But putting that aside, I hated these people. I hated Theo, and that matters because...
Let it go, Nyfears!
Bad pacing is often less about narrative structure than it is about character. Like all those stories which are bad, but people still really enjoy them, like they're often really poorly paced, but people just like the characters, you know? Elrond and Durin's storyline is quite slow, it's kind of meandering, but every scene with them and Deza is a joy to watch just for their relationship. They're full of heart and love, and it feels nice to be in. It's got little bursts of excitement, cycles and stories of their own and intrigue. It's not that the pacing here is faster than the Southlands, it's not, but the pacing issues here are less visible. In these people, in the Southlands, am I a terrible person? I don't know, but I did not care about them. I didn't like them. Theo is so frustrating every time he's on screen, and not in like that, oh, I'm so sorry for him, I feel and understand his pain and am invested in his growth. No, more like, cast it into the fire! And all the moments we were clearly meant to feel things for these people, hope and fear, I didn't.
Do you believe it? Do you believe it?
Yay!
I did not care for the
Southlands.
You do know you're allowed more than one take with the extras. This feels like a high school production where like someone holds up a sign and says, now you chair. The Southlands does not have what Elrond and Durin do, partly because of those structural issues. This story gets splintered over and over again, and we just don't get much time to know them. But also because in virtually every scene we have with them, they're a distinctly unlikable people.
Oh, let it go, Nyfears!
And when they aren't unlikable, they're just bland. We know virtually nothing about them, their culture, their way of life. They're not visually interesting with their own distinct architecture or costuming, like Rohan versus Gondor, even though they're meant to be this fallen kingdom of men, supposedly. Half of them betray each other to go join the orcs. Their luggage dragged around by our main characters. It doesn't help that this village feels basically irrelevant in the grand scheme of Sauron returning and the rings. They feel like extras who have been turned into main characters. Arondir and Bronwyn get virtually no time together as a couple that isn't very quickly cut off so that they can deliver more plot or exposition when they are allowed to be in the same storyline. We're meant to care about their love story because it's forbidden. This is a rare thing in Middle-earth, but we never really see them making any decisions together or how they have to change or how they depend on each other. The forbiddenness is of passing relevancy, and like Bronwyn is fine as a character. She is firmly in that this is okay part of Rings of Power, perfectly functional, watchable, fine, but she's generic, she's bland, she hasn't got the room to become a fully fledged character. She's meant to have this arc where she becomes the leader of her people in a time of need.
A burden I never sought to take up.
Few of the finest leaders do.
But we don't really see this, we're just told it happens. Like, she kills an orc, proving they're coming, and then everyone just kind of acquiesces to her or doesn't really stop her from taking charge.
Who gave you the right to decide?
Everyone who decided to come to this tower, Waldrick, including you.
Aragorn's ascension to leader in the Lord of the Rings films is littered with beautiful moments where we see the kind of king he can be. Humble, brave, a warrior, a poet, a wise man, going through various trials where he has to prove himself in different ways. Taking up leadership of the Fellowship, then lead at Helm's Deep, then a trial facing the Oathbreakers, him accepting the Sword of Kings, and then finally Gondor. But more importantly, we understand that leadership for him means overcoming the sins of Isildur, and in those struggles, in overcoming that, his ascension feels earned. He proves it to others and himself. It means something. We also see what his leadership means for Gondor, a fading kingdom rejuvenated. So what does leadership mean for Bronwyn? She didn't seem reluctant or the only one willing to take up the burden, or even the only one proved capable. We don't see her make mistakes and grapple with those. She doesn't really have to earn her people's respect beyond convincing them there's a threat at all. The closest we get is this crisis over whether they should stand up to the orcs or just surrender.
Who will stand with me? And when they march upon us, this tower will fall.
But guess what? Those two scenes, they are immediately next to each other, like literally, and then they're immediately resolved. There is basically no tension there. There's not really much of an arc. In the opening, she is a capable person who wants to keep her people safe and has no qualms taking charge. And at the end, she's a capable person who wants to keep her people safe and has no qualms taking charge. She's not really a different person in the first episode than she is in the last, nor is her relationship with her people different. I mean, if her arc is about her trying to stay true to herself in the face of adversity, that's great, but we just don't get enough scenes for that to really come through, enough failures or successes. There's nothing wrong with having a static character arc, but the story treats this like this is a positive arc where she does change. There's also not a strong sense of what not having a leader has done to these people, or that they have an arc about them becoming better. So when Bronwyn says,
But if you choose to stand with me and fight, this tower will no longer be a reminder of our frailty, but a symbol of our strength.
this just doesn't hit the way they clearly want it to, because it really only feels like they're fighting for their survival. Of course, you can, again, say that this is the point, that they're meant to be vile.
What's one of them doing here?
Because this story is about how we aren't defined by our past, by our ancestors, and anyone can become a hero, right? No matter how vile. But this feels clumsy when the story very much clearly depends on me caring about these people and the stakes. They're never really allowed to emerge into being more lovable and defined. At best, they just kind of get rid of the really evil Southlanders. Arondir is actually one of the better characters in this show. He's in that this is fine, this is good Rings of Power circle. And that's largely because he actually has this whole scene where he, an elf, is forced to cut down a tree. That is a really interesting creative decision that lets us explore him. He gets this moment to apologize to it, and it builds into the themes of the series and the stuff that we've seen him do before. Bronwyn just never really gets this kind of moment where she gets to be interesting, you know, to do something that only she would and can do. She's presented as a healer, but those skills and knowledge really never lead to her doing anything interesting, like, I don't know, healing the supposed king of the Southlands that they've been looking for 1,000 years? And God, Theyre. He's like the annoying child companion video game character. He isn't enjoyable to watch on screen like Arondir, he isn't fine to watch on screen like Bronwyn, he's just annoying. And again, we're left asking, why make the entire crux of the story turn on this? We don't really see characters making decisions at the end of the story that they weren't capable of making at the start. I guess Theo doesn't hate Arondir anymore? If we enjoyed these characters, if they were interesting, faced complex problems, had deep relationships, the overall pace of the show and the lackluster mysteries would be a lot more tolerable, but they don't. It's not an issue to have unlikable characters unless the stakes depend on us caring about what happens to them. And really the issue is more that they're mostly bland, especially because the Southlands doesn't feel like existentially relevant to the fate of the world and to the broader stories that they clearly want to tell. Fundamentally, there are two ways slow pacing works. One, when it's used to help us get to know the characters, get really invested in them, which Rings of Power with its crippling 4 storylines and boasting 22 main characters just doesn't do. Or when it's used to set up a climactic finale that pays off your patience. Attack on Titan is kind of like this. It really drags out its plot at times, but it's worth it because of the bang at the end. You've probably got a story just like this in your head right now. These stories require a lot of setup because the climax is deep, nuanced, complex, satisfying, and so worth it looking back, and Rings of Power is... not that. There are 2 climax episodes in Rings of Power. There's episode 6 and there's episode 8. Episode 6 has the bar brawl in the Southlands and Mount Doom erupting, and episode 8 has Halbrand revealing himself as Sauron. There are other issues with episode 6 we'll get to, but the bottom line is it's crippled by us not really caring about this village in the Southlands. I don't feel much watching them die. I don't feel their despair. I want to care. I go into stories because I want to feel things. I want to be invested. But I just didn't here. It doesn't help we're not super invested in Numenor coming to their aid, not in the way that we are in Rohan coming to Gondor's aid. The battle is interesting from moment to moment. You know, watching 2 guys wipe out orcs with a chain is still fun. The eruption is still visually spectacular. Arondir's anime moves are still enjoyable to watch moment to moment aesthetically. And as always, Joseph Mawle's Adar is fantastic in every scene he's in, but I think we're attracted more to the spectacle in episode 6. We get caught up in that, and once the spectacle fades, it gives way to meh. You still feel things because the music's telling you to feel things and there are some interesting things to watch, but it's not the deep investment in the story that leaves you thinking about it afterwards. $1 billion can buy Amazon Pretty Pictures or 300 episodes of Seinfeld or the entire budget of almost every Harry Potter film put together, but it can't buy love. Mount Doom erupting is certainly a phenomenal end. I actually really love the shot of all the water pouring into the lava, but it's not the, of course, wow, this was what it all was for, moment that I think they wanted it to be. It doesn't retroactively make the pacing of the first 5 episodes that much richer, and most of the moments that episode 6 is meant to culminate in...
To your positions! To the true King of the Southlands!
King of the Southlands! All 2 villages of it. And one of them's burned down. Gotta start somewhere. This reminds me of like in Skyrim when a Jarl's like, I rule over this region, and it's like 14 people. But these moments just fall a little flat and awkward, and not because they're like inherently bad, but they just haven't had the room to build to and breathe for us to care. But there is one storyline which comes to a climactic point in episode 6 which does work, and that's Galadriel's confrontation with Adar. It's one of the best scenes in the show, and it's naturally built to with Galadriel's vengeance quest, but also Joseph Mawle's fantastic performance. He outclasses her ethically as a prisoner in this interesting dynamic that digs into some themes Tolkien himself grappled with. And importantly, this is an arc that they actually have invested time in exploring and deepening and understanding, so it does work when she realizes how far she's gone. Fundamentally, good slow pacing keeps us invested by taking the time to get to know our characters or setting up a climactic finale that makes it all worth it in the end. But Rings of Power's slow pacing is the result of a jumbled web of storylines repeatedly stopping and starting and interrupting each other to introduce new elements, preventing us from getting invested in any of them or progressing the story. It's not a deliberate choice so much as a consequence of them trying to cram so much plot into the structure they chose. And yet, and you're not going to believe me, but for all of its slow pacing issues, one of its most critical problems is that it's actually too fast, and that brings us to... Well, Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet and... So you remember how Game of Thrones built up to its climactic season really slowly for years, but rushed through the resolution with teleporting armies, unthoughtful climaxes, and an ultimately bizarre solution to the central question of who will be on the Iron Throne?
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
Literally anyone. That is poor pacing too. Rushing through things and not giving them room to breathe, not having enough setup for the payoff to let us care about them and invest in them, and so they land as hard as you clearly want them to. Okay, so the show is called The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, right? Okay, so naturally, the rings should be important, right? And this is my wedding ring, one ring with a line of my vows around it in Elvish. We would want to take our time to set it up, to do it right, especially because this is one of the few actual canon events in the show. We'd want to have a whole storyline built around it to make this feel like an organic development, because ultimately 28 minutes, woo, done, there they are, shiny, the 3 rings, not this one. That's all, 28 minutes. Between Sauron being involved, between even knowing that there is a whole plot line that has anything to do with the rings at all, and the 3 rings being created, 28 minutes out of 9 hours total. And that includes, by the way, resolving Galadriel's entire revelation that Halbrand is Sauron. And in the show, it's like maybe a few days. Like, it feels mean to say, but it feels tacked on. It feels like they almost put this beat in the show just to justify calling it Rings of Power. Or you to use Lord of the Rings. That's the cynic in me, but that's what it feels like. Which sucks, not only because it's actually in the lore and I care about that, I wanted to see this, but because it's actually some of the best stuff in the series and it shows they can do better. Gil-galad and Celebrimbor talking about how it needs to be a circular object so the light can bounce off against itself almost musically is beautifully soft Tolkienian magic. You know, Tolkien's stories are full of magical craftsmen, there being power in the act of creation itself, and we see a glimpse of that here. Celebrimbor repeating Sauron's words without really knowing where he heard them is the sort of conniving we want from Sauron. That subtle shift from the desire to create for beauty and love to something for power, out of the fear of decay, of loss, of the decline of the elves and the world growing further from God. That's good, that's genuinely interesting. And there is this whole other story that so many people wanted to see that would have supported all of this. Tolkien's story here is at heart a character drama, a court drama of biblical proportions. We needed more of this, but instead we just get a glimpse, a nod to what could have been.
Call it a gift.
28 minutes. This event is going to have massive ramifications for Rings of Power in the future, and yet we don't feel that because the pacing is rushed. And again, it's made more baffling that they could have done this very story where Sauron comes to the elves, he teaches them this craft, and Galadriel susses them out, all of which happens in the episode, just kind of, you know, crammed together and in line with the lore. There's some beautiful Tolkienian work in this episode that doesn't get the support, the bread that needs to really hit home. It's an echo of what could have been. It's like they knew what we wanted and yet for some reason thought this whole story in the Southlands would be more interesting. The Southlands, by the way, in the scope of this epic story they actually want to tell in this series is virtually filler. Like, it's invented, but not because there's like a gap in the story, it's just invented. And all of this is made weirder by this quote from the showrunners.
Quite often in serialized television, the last episode of the season is table setting for the second season. We don't feel that way. Our last episode is the ultimate culmination of every single fuse we've lit in the first 7 episodes. Hopefully, people are really satisfied with the big booms that happen, though they might be emotional booms rather than volcanic ones.
Weird because episode 8 is bafflingly disconnected from the rest of the story. They literally leave the Southlands and all of its characters behind. Durin doesn't even appear. The Harfoots are entirely irrelevant to the core story. The writers seem to know how disconnected it was on some level. I know the term contrived gets thrown around a lot these days, often by people who don't really know what it means, but listen. At the end of episode 7, we discover that Halbrand has been mortally wounded by something off screen. Doesn't matter, and I mean that. It literally does not matter, because the point of this scene is not to create a crisis point where one of our main characters is near death, requiring desperate measures and a rise in tension. No, the point of this scene is to get Halbrand to Eregion so they can make the story of the final episode, to get the plot to where the writers want it to be. Galadriel Galadriel realizes his wound is so bad that it requires elvish healing for some reason, apparently, from something off-screen, and keep in mind it was only required in Fellowship because Frodo had a magical wound. But it's not so bad, apparently, that he can't ride on horseback for 5 straight days to a region like this. I'm fine. This isn't hurting at all. I genuinely laughed when I saw this, and then, within 5 minutes of arriving in Eregion, he's fine. We don't even really need to see the healing, it's not important because plot. This screams to me the writers knew they had to be in Mordor in episode 7, but had to somehow be in Eregion in episode 8 to be involved in the story there. But they couldn't come up with a good reason why Halbrand, the new king of the Southland who has just returned, would immediately leave his people. So instead, our character is just injured enough to go find the magical healing in the exact place the plot needs them to be, but he's perfectly fine enough that it doesn't get in the way of the plot they actually want to tell. Comparatively, Frodo getting injured like he does is a big deal, and the story treats it so. Writing is all about contriving a story, bringing it about, but you're not meant to see the writers pulling the strings like you can here. You can kind of feel this earlier on in the scene where Galadriel figures out the mark of Sauron, that it was suddenly allowed to happen when the writers promptly wanted Galadriel to go to the Southlands. And this fast-paced issue pops up in another couple of places throughout the series too. We have Bronwyn's sudden shift from hope to despair to hope in 2 scenes immediately next to each other, and her supposed ascension to leader. We have the hook in Elrond's story to build a forge so large Celebrimbor can
devise something of real power.
This is ominous. We should feel the labor of this. This is the stuff leading up to the 3 rings. This is the decline of Celebrimbor. But instead, we get a few scattered shots of this forge being built like a PowerPoint, and the critical decision for the dwarves and elves to even work together in the first place is actually off-screen. Then we have the conflict between the faithful and the Kingsmen in Numenor, and that conflict is so rushed that the writers primarily communicate it in one of the laziest ways possible. A dude giving a manifesto.
Elf workers, taking your trades!
They took our job!
The writers had to establish this conflict because they want to do the fall of Numenor later, but by this point they kind of need to get the story moving. Keep in mind we only even get to start the story 2 hours in, and the scene only comes 4 hours in. All of this leaves Rings of Power feeling simultaneously boring and slow, but also lacking depth to its conflicts because it has to rush through so much of it. And this is largely because a lot of these conflicts are pretty independent of each other. They don't feel like they feed into an overall narrative. This doesn't mean there aren't things to enjoy. Elrond, Durin, Disa, Nori, the music, the visuals, just the feeling of being in an epic fantasy world. The feeling of the world is so on point at times, but there are so many cracks in the overall vision for the show that it's left feeling firmly meh looking back. It's so very much why? Why would you do the story this way? Why would you make it the way you did? Not only for the story you're adapting, but the stuff you invent as well, and nothing demonstrates that more than
the sea is always right!
The sea is always right!
All of that explains why it feels boring a lot of the time, but there's also a lot of just clumsy writing too. It often lacks subtext.
The sea is always right!
The sea is always right! Elf ships on our shore. Elf workers, taking your trades. Elf lover.
I'm good.
One day, our true king will return and pry us right out from under your pointy boots.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
Subtext is really important when writing because it gives us a whole other level to engage with the text. Subtext means we're looking for what we're missing, what other meanings there might be, what's underneath what we're being told. We're actively engaged with figuring out the text, and that makes any reveals and developments that much more compelling. But this lack of subtext can make Rings feel shallow from scene to scene. There's less to engage with, compounding already existing issues, partly because of how much they're cramming into the show again. They end up telling more than showing because the conflicts and character dynamics just don't have room to breathe. A slow story can be fascinating if there's a lot of depth to just watching characters talk, and subtext is one way you do that. The show Hannibal is fantastic at this, but some of the dialogue in Rings of Power is just cringe.
The sea is always right!
Why not say something like, the tides take us where the tides may, or the sea does not ask which way it should pull us. Anything. It also sometimes delivers exposition clumsily.
Only twice in known history has a pairing between elves and humans even been attempted, and on each occasion, it ended in tragedy.
It ended in death.
Are you familiar with the Song of the Roots of Theyre? Recount it for me, please.
An obscure legend.
This is a little bit too for me. Of course, clumsy exposition doesn't stop us enjoying things. Sci-fi and fantasy is full of it. But again, you're seeing more and more of those cracks. Both characters already know these things, and it's clearly for the audience's benefit. It's not that there's no in-story reason for the characters to say this, it's just that it could have been a lot more natural. Make it so Elrond chances across the mithril tale himself and pieces it together, or overhears Celebrimbor and Gil-galad talking and have Durin ask about it. You know, this myth, because he wouldn't know, would he? And then there's these clumsy lines here and there, where they're trying to sound more profound than they really are.
The likeness of one fallen preserved upon a living thing.
Like a spring rain over the bones of a spoilt carcass.
His suggestions were but the key that unlocked the dam.
I would sooner kneecap a stallion than seek to imprison the mighty commander of the Northern Army.
Or yes, the famous one.
Do you know why a ship floats? Her gaze is not downward but up, fixed upon the light that guides her.
But sometimes the lights shine just as brightly reflected in the water as they do in the sky. It's hard to say which way is up and which way is down.
Sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness.
But that seems so simple.
Weirdly, that rock and boat metaphor is not actually as bad as some people like to say. People really latched onto it, especially because it's in like the opening scene and they can go, look, it's awful right from the start. It's an extended metaphor, which is meant to be expounding the themes of the story. Galadriel touches the darkness metaphorically as she goes down this path of vengeance, and only in nearly going too far does she see what's wrong, does she see the light. The imagery of sinking and floating, of up and down shows up a lot in the series, and on that level, the metaphor works, like as an artistic motif. It works as this kind of Manichean good versus evil thing. But it is clumsy. It works more than how it appears throughout the series than it does in this scene. Like when she's about to go too far, when she's about to kill Adar in the barn, and we get this Dutch angle of up tipping down, that's it. But the metaphor here is clumsy, it is forced. Good metaphors communicate the mundane more effectively. They hit harder than just stating it outright, or communicate the complex simply. Bad metaphors muddy the meaning, and comparing knowing the difference between good and evil and knowing the difference between the light in the sky and the lights in the water is muddy. We aren't normally fooled or confused by the lights in the water. We don't naturally think about why a rock sinks or that it has a gaze. The metaphor here adds complexity where it should add simplicity. It's a manufactured metaphor. One of those ones you can feel the writers are talking to the audience. Like Galadriel, I don't think would naturally respond like this. You know, this is a conversation in the writer's room, and you don't want us to see behind the veil. You don't want us to see them pulling those strings. The metaphor here reads to me like one of those moments that you get really attached to as a writer, where you want to be profound, the poeticism fits in with all this other stuff, you know, explains the story, but you lose sight of how forced it is because you want to make it happen. Compare this, though, to a later moment between Galadriel and Tarmiriel.
I beg of you, Miriel, choose not the path of fear, but that of faith. Faith may bind one heart, Galadriel, but it is too fine a thread from which to hang a kingdom.
This naturally arises from their argument and communicates the themes of the series. Faith does feel like a fragile thing, like thread made stronger when multiple are woven together, when multiple people have it. But it's also something you have to work at, whereas the kingdom feels big, heavy, and yeah, you can hold things together with thread, but is it enough to hold a kingdom together? But sometimes the metaphors are redundant. Take this line from Gil-galad.
We foresaw that if it had, she might have inadvertently kept alive the very evil she sought to defeat. For the same wind that seeks to blow out a fire may also cause its spread.
The metaphor here isn't bad, but it is redundant. You can basically cut the first half of the sentence and still keep its meaning. Imagine if instead he said, we foresaw darker days if she had, for the same wind that seeks to blow out a fire may also cause its spread. It's these moments that you can feel they were trying to imitate Tolkien, but not quite managing it, you know? Again, a detail most people won't notice, but the cracks are everywhere. Something people will notice, though, is when the dialogue is a little too close to Marvel.
Bit southern for elves, no? Typically takes you people weeks just to decide to take a ship.
If I may.
Commander of the northern armies of High King Gil-galad.
Halbrand of the Southlands.
You will inform Farazon that she's escaped. I informed him last time. That was a dog.
So, how about this? I'll do the floors and you do the goblets, and the last one to finish pays for dinner.
I'm not in the habit of going off with strange young men.
Very wise. If I see any, you'll be the first to know.
And you smell of rotten leaves?
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
None of these are story-breaking, but they do snap you out of it. It's grating, out of place, especially when it appears alongside dialogue, which is clearly trying to be lyrical and Tolkienian. And they should just cut Kemen. Cut him completely. Just the worst. Númenóreans, Southlanders, and Hobbits all use terms like okay, which is actually a very modern word, or thanks in modern ways that Tolkien didn't. So the writers are inconsistently slipping in and out of this style. There's also this weird pattern where characters will offer ideas or advice, which is pretty basic or obvious, but the story treats it like it's kind of profound.
Couldn't the right alloy also amplify those qualities?
There are many ways to kill an orc. Stab, twist, gut. Come at me.
It is a map of the Southlands.
But that wasn't what provoked her anger, was it?
I demanded to speak with her father.
And yet, for all of these moments of inconsistent dialogue, there are also some truly beautiful and Tolkienian moments in the show. Later in the season, several dwarven miners are trapped underground after trying to mine mithril on Durin's orders. After rescuing them, Durin goes to fearfully face up to his father, and we get this moment.
Our people believe that when a new dwarf king is crowned, the voices of all his forebears flow into him, sharing with him their counsel, their wisdom, even their mistakes. But you need not wait for that day to hear my voice. Forever am I with you, my son. Even in anger. Sometimes in anger most of all. There is nothing to forgive.
Not only is this emphasis on forgiveness and family deeply Tolkienian, but the line is genuinely beautiful and follows on from one of the strongest scenes in the show, itself invoking Tolkien's love for the power of music, with characters we actually care about. Durin's father gets very little screen time in this series, but he leaves a strong impression, largely because he's given moments where his dialogue is so smooth and is backed up by narrative weight. Elrond and Durin's storyline is full of moments like this. Like when Elrond first arrives in Khazad-dûm, Durin doesn't want to talk to him.
My tears may be the blink of an eye to an elf, but I've lived an entire life in that time. A life you missed.
Congratulations. On your wife, your children. I hope you can come to forgive me, and I would like very much to apologize to your family as well.
It's a genuinely sweet, sentimental moment about good people coming to terms, and also Elrond is described in the books as kind as summer, something I actually don't think we quite got in the films, but we do here. It's also a conflict naturally arising from Tolkien's own words and world building. There's this line in Fellowship of the Ring where Legolas is talking about how elves perceive time, and he says,
"Nay, time does not tarry ever, but change and growth is not in all things and places alike. For the elves the world moves, and it moves both very swift and very slow. Swift because they themselves change little, and all else fleets by. It is a grief to them. Slow because they do not count the running years, not for themselves. The passing seasons are but ripples, ever repeated in the long, long stream. Yet, beneath the sun, all things must wear to an end at last."
20 years is a blink of an eye to Elrond, because to him, he's been away for like a month. How elves see the world differently is a core piece of Tolkien's world building, and this tension arises from that. And equally, for all of the lines which lack subtext, there are also lines which have a lot of it.
How many have you killed?
Many.
Good.
I would not use such words. It darkens the heart to call dark deeds good.
Up until this point, this is exactly what Galadriel has been doing, and she's finally reckoning with that. When she comes face to face with Eddar, she's morally outclassed and is realizing how far she has gone, doing dark deeds, killing, murdering, not out of a need, but desire, out of vengeance. Seeing this same desire echoed in Theo, she doesn't want him to go down that same path. This line isn't just about her giving advice to Theo, but it's also her reckoning with her own actions. That's subtext. She has to fight not only on the right side, but for the right reasons. Galadriel's arc has other issues, we'll get to that, but this is good. And for all the clumsy exposition, there's also plenty of exposition which is totally fine.
Thank you for bringing me here.
Thank our last king. And it's because of him this place wasn't torn down.
He was loyal to the elves.
Is loyal. We forced him from the throne for it.
This naturally arises from the scene, involves us and the character learning information about Numenor, and Galadriel asks questions she naturally would after the elves have not been allowed at Numenor for 300 years.
Our ancestors were not given anything. They paid for this isle with the blood of their kin.
This too is good. It gives us an insight into Numenorean culture and doesn't feel like we're being read a history book. Tension and conflict is an easy way to hide exposition like this, and it works. And yes, for all of the clumsy metaphors and poeticisms in the series, there are also some which are perfectly fine and sound even Tolkienian from time to time.
Sun runs so deep. Even the rocks and roots now believe them.
I have been awake since before the breaking of the first silence.
Where there is love, it is never truly dark. How could it not grow in a home like yours?
When all other senses sleep, the eye of hope is first to awaken, last to shut.
Faith may bind one heart, Galadriel, but it is too fine a thread from which to hang a kingdom.
I actually really love that line, some lies go so deep even the rocks and the trees believe them. In fact, the whole conversation between Eddar and Galadriel is quite good, as are many other conversations between Elrond and Durin.
I care nothing for whatever is in that chamber. I do care for you, for this friendship, and secrets do not become it.
I have said it already. 100 times over, in every way but words.
You speak of greatness for me, but you suffocate in me any ambition, any desire, any thought that does not originate in you.
It was a plea to the rocks to release the bodies of the miners with breath still inside them.
Dwarven anger outlives even elven memory.
And I know some people are going to manufacture a hissy fit about why these lines can't be good, but they're fine. I don't know why you would need to manufacture more reasons for something to be terrible than there are. These are, in a way, small issues, right? Like, any one of these is fine, but it's kind of death from 1,000 cuts. You notice that inconsistency over time. It's often frustrating to listen to, and it's only sometimes interesting to listen to, leaving it very meh. But Rings is broken on a more fundamental level, because we need to talk about the eugenics hobbits.
Nobody goes off train. And nobody walks alone. Nobody goes off train.
I did not know going into Rings of Power that I would be learning about the brutal survivalist reality of Hobbit life, but I did. In episode 2, Nori is trying to hide old senile maybe sound from her fellow Harfoots, E.T. style, and when he starts doing the scene from the 2009 Nicolas Cage classic Knowing, Nori's dad dislocates his foot, impliedly affected by the wizard Sauron's magic from afar. Soon enough, old senile maybe Sauron is discovered. And of course, Nori's family immediately fear the obvious problem with this. They're going to be left to die in the wilderness.
We can't carry the cart without you. We're going to be left behind.
Because old senile stumbles into the Harfoot camp, and the first reaction of the Harfoots is,
"Our laws are clear. Any Harfoot that breaks them is to be decaravanned."
oh, this is, horrific. There's no other word for it, but don't worry, Sadok, their leader, shows mercy.
And the Brandyfoot cart will be with us.
At the back of the caravan.
Oh, being in the back of the caravan's not that bad. I mean, they're a tight-knit community. I'm sure they're all gonna help each other. Just kidding, I shit you not, the Half-Woods will not help you.
You may as well have stamped our name in the book of the left behinds.
Even if you're injured. And not like because they all have their own cart and so they can't help. We see a whole host of Half-Woods happily plodding along right in front of them, leaving this family with an injured person pulling the cart and thinking nothing of it. These people know their supposed friend has a dislocated foot and can't really walk, but they do not give a shit. Charles Darwin would have had a field day with these discount hobbits.
Die! You deserve it!
If you cannot pull your own cart, you will end up off trail and you will walk alone. And this is made worse by the fact that they're punishing Nori's family for her crime. This is like some North Korean level generational punishment shit. And then in the same episode, the Half-Woods have the audacity to read out a list of names of the left behinds in a kind of memorial that they remember fondly and laugh about.
We remember those from prior migrations who fell behind. Miles Brightapple, stuck in the snows of the mountain pass.
We wait for you.
Ah, Bindi Hoop Snankawank. Snankawank? I can't say that. I can't say that. Ah, Bindi Nut Hoopersnatch who choked on a berry and we just stood around and watched him die. Are we meant to assume Miles Brightapple got his foot stuck in the snow and they turn around and they're just like, leave him, we must continue on. He's like, no, guys, I just need a little bit of help. And then it's too late for you. This is some Ayn Rand no duty to help bull. Like, the implication is that they didn't have any choice, but they very much do have a choice to help the Brandyfoots here, especially to help the father who is completely innocent. Like, I'd almost get it if it was just Nori, right?
He's responsible, isn't he? The big fella.
What precisely do you expect me to do about it?
What you ought to have done at the camp. Take their wheels and leave them.
And this threat of being de-caravaned hangs over the family the entire series. At this point, it's not even passively leaving the weak behind because of the need to survive. Like, it's actively murdering people who would be able to keep up, punishing them for crimes they did not commit. And to be clear, this is the main point of tension in the story, and they did not need to do this. But it gets worse, because the most important way you can measure whether someone succeeded in their writing is understanding what they were trying to accomplish and asking whether they did that. And
so there's this amazing kind of chant, like nobody goes off trail, nobody walks alone. Community to them is everything, essentially. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I kind of thought of it as like this wheel of home that they all keep pushing, and everyone's telling Nori, if someone leaves this wheel, eventually more people will start leaving and it'll fall flat and there won't be community anymore. So stop doing it.
Everything in behind the scenes interviews says this is meant to be the feel-good, whimsical story about family, community, love. Tonally, the writers and actors clearly wanted this storyline to be the cutesy, charming one. They're meant to be endearing.
Enchanting.
Nobody goes up here.
And nobody walks alone.
But the writers here did not achieve what they set out to do. Community does not feel like the most important thing to the Half-Woods. It feels individualistic and uncaring. Nori is in a way set apart by how much she cares about others. And when Nori talks about this fear of the community disintegrating, and that's why they're like this, that's just not really there in the story. And then, perhaps most egregiously, at the end of the series, Nori's father gives a speech that is seemingly meant to summarize the moral we're meant to get from the story.
We're Harfoots. We stay true to each other, no matter how the path winds, or how steep it gets. We face it with our hearts even bigger than our feet.
What? That is literally the one thing they don't do.
Take their wheels and leave them.
They don't go slay dragons because they're too busy Spartacusing their weak and injured. Now, Melva does admit she's wrong and that they should go help the stranger, but then Sadok says something really weird.
Just once. Once. It would be grand if you weren't right all the time.
Melva was the main one pushing to leave the family to die. She hasn't been right the whole season. That's the point. We're being told the Half-Woods are kind and stick together, but not really shown it. If the writers wanted this to be a heartwarming story about half-wits whose hearts are bigger than their feet, then why make the half-wits softcore eugenicists? It doesn't matter how well written the dialogue or the characters are in this story, the decision to make the half-wits Darwinian eugenicists, to make this the main point of tension in the first place, was a bad idea from the start. This does not feel Tolkienian. It doesn't feel like something Tolkien would write to me, and I think the writers really underestimated the impression Malva saying these things would leave on people in this story. And like, the weird thing is, again, the writers set themselves up to do a very different story. Right from the start, we're told about all of the dangers along the migratory road. Why not make the story about those? You can even have the weird cultists following them around if you want. You could have them wary of this big fella coming with them, but ultimately deciding to take him along because he needs the help and because he's now a part of the community. Then, at the end, the stranger chooses to leave in the night because he fears that he keeps endangering his friends, but the half-wits, with hearts bigger than their feet, go to help their friend and save him just as much as he's saved them. Either they set out to write a pseudo-Darwinian story about hobbits, which is a terrible idea from the start, or they wanted to write a heartwarming story about family and community and hobbits whose hearts are bigger than their feet, in which case they did not succeed. I've seen a bunch of people wave this off as, it's realistic because they're migrating and this is a harsh reality of nomadic life, but I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Middle-earth is not reality. They didn't have to do it this way. Like, rising crime rates in the Shire because of a lack of police infrastructure is also realistic, but that doesn't mean the Brandy Bucks are forming a local militia to take out the Sackville Bagginses. It's also realistic to depict gratuitous sex, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea to do in Middle-earth, making it, I think, a poor adaptation choice. The Half-Wit storyline is a great example of how Rings of Power's issues are honestly less about like individual scenes or bits of dialogue and more the overall idea and structure for the story in the first place. On a moment-to-moment basis, there are lots of scenes across all the storylines which are perfectly enjoyable, functional, fine, whatever, but they're inside stories which just aren't quite right on that bigger level, and that's often what we notice more. And another of the worst scenes in the show, where the writers clearly set out to do something and did not succeed, appears in episode 4.
They took our jobs! Yeah, they took our jobs! They did! They took our jobs! Elf ships on our shore. Elf workers taking your trades. I say, the Queen's either blind or an elf lover. Today, they take away your faith. But what of tomorrow? What then? Do the elves take your homes? Your businesses? Your children? Your very lives?
I mean, it says something that the dialogue is just the same as Skyrim. This crowd looks like a Monty Python skit. The writers want us to think Numenor is impressive, to be awestruck with their power and majesty, that they are the height of human civilization in Middle-earth.
Coming from the Southlands, Hal is used to men that everything's pretty run down. So I think he's pretty impressed and amazed that men can create a kingdom such as that.
Numenorians are larger than life in Tolkien's mythology, and we want Numenor to be impressive. We want Numenorians themselves to feel strong, regal, powerful, worthy of being the greatest civilization Middle-earth ever to exist.
It seems like this ultimately undermined that image. They have all the trappings of power and majesty and set design, costumes, wealth, and CGI, but these scenes make them seem not only infantile, but kind of dumb and petty. It's also a weird leap of logic for people who have lived in isolation on an island for 300 years. Galadriel arrived like a day ago, and she doesn't even want to be here. And this scene is virtually the key one for us to see the divide in Numenor between the Kingsmen and Faithful, but it's also the shallowest way the writers could possibly express this conflict. The issue isn't that they're not good, it's that they don't command your respect. They're meant to be more like Tywin Lannister, let's say, shrewd, intelligent, formidable, not a good guy, but they feel just like Walder Frey, who's kind of just pathetic. Show me the ruling class drunk on their own accomplishments, obsessed with a past their ancestors built that they think they earned, tombs so grand as a way of continuing past this mortal life, as Tolkien himself writes in The Two Towers, and they accurately quote in The Return of the King.
Kings made tombs more splendid than the houses of the living, and counted the old names of their descent dearer than the names of their sons. Childless lords sat in aged halls, musing on heraldry, or in high cold towers asking questions of the stars.
Numenor is meant to be interesting because they think they're better than everyone else, and it's such an intoxicating lie to believe because in some ways, they truly are magnificent. Numenorians live longer, they're technologically advanced, they're smart, they have a rich history. It's kind of the way that we sort of look back at Rome in a way. But this line makes them appear like a mob from The Simpsons. Clearly not how the writers intended them to come across, even if Ar-Pharazôn does point this out.
Men of Numenor, or a gaggle of mewling children?
In the books, this division between elves and men comes from an existential crisis. As Tolkien himself writes,
"This story is about death and the desire of deathlessness, which is hardly more than to say it's a tale written by man."
They grow jealous of elvish immortality and seek it for themselves, believing themselves more deserving, even going to war over it. You can keep the suspicion, but turning this conflict into a cheap elvish racism ploy with writing which sounds a little too close to a New York Times caricature of immigration politics was a bad idea, even if it's unintentional. And we do see they can do Numenorians right in characters like Elendil and Tamiriel, and I guess Ar-Pharazôn, but they don't extend that same gravitas or intelligence to the masses. In virtually every scene we get, they feel like bumbling oafs. Again, I can't help but feel the cramming of the series in this scene, needing to communicate this conflict exists, but not having the time to meaningfully explore it. So they go with the easiest route, a dude giving a manifesto to an angry crowd. It's very tell and not show. At the moment, this conflict has the depth of a slogan. And this problem is only deepened by other scenes. The issue not being that Galadriel wins, she's a first stage elf, awesome, but that we don't really get many scenes where the Numenorian soldiers ever are allowed to feel formidable. At best, the Numenorians feel a lukewarm version of whatever the writers wanted them to be, and certainly a lukewarm version of the ones in the books.
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
Do you remember being baffled why Daenerys would position her unsullied outside the walls of Winterfell? Or why Dany forgot about the Iron Fleet? Or why Bran was made king?
And who has a better story?
Leave me alone. These are issues which technically have in-story justifications. Oh, because they couldn't fit inside the walls, or because Bran is a neutral figure between the kingdoms, or famously,
well, Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
But they're awkward answers. You know they're awkward, I know they're awkward, the writers knew they're awkward, and they're what we're gonna call the why factor. And Rings of Power has a lot of them. Like, how do the Southlanders sneak out of Ostirith past the Orcs into their village without the Orcs noticing? We're told that they're basically at the tower already.
Days. Maybe hours.
You could say, multiple days have passed between these two shots and they snuck out under the cover of darkness, but the fact we have to imagine that connective tissue is awkward. Or why don't they just leave? At the end of the season, the refugees talk about heading to Pelagia, a safe Numenorian colony over the mountains. They didn't know how many orcs were out there coming to kill them, and they didn't know help was coming if they could hold out long enough, and they had a decent head start on the orcs. Again, you can say, well, they're too hemmed into a valley and they can't get over the mountains, or there's too many weak and injured for them to make the travel, but they're not too weak and injured to fight? Or why didn't the elves see the giant 100-mile-long trench leading into the volcano?
Key to the eyes of the elves.
I mean, they had a whole watchtower for this purpose, and again, it's not impossible they didn't see it, it's just kind of awkward, and it could have been very easily solved by having the tunnels all underground, which they seemingly did at the start. It would have been invisible looking from a tower. And then they're just a bunch of little ones. Why does Halbrand need elvish healing? Well, doesn't matter. Why did Bronwyn just abandon her kid on a full day's journey without saying anything to him? Or why did Galadriel have to stay in Numenor supposedly? They didn't want her there, she didn't want to be there. Why didn't any characters look at the supposedly super important artifact Ada ran away with for hours? Why did they make Galadriel leap off a boat and think she was going to swim back to Middle Earth? Again, you can manufacture reasons for all these things in the story, but why couldn't you just do it in a way that's a little less awkward? Just make it so Galadriel is still inside of land at this point or something. They're not plot holes or contradictions as a lot of people are obsessed with calling them. No, they're clumsy connective tissue for plotting, where you can feel the writers contriving it to be a certain way, to go in a certain direction. Think of it like in Game of Thrones, I feel like they put the Unsullied outside the wall because they really wanted this shot. Because it looks cool. A wall of undead overwhelming some of the best trained warriors in the world. That's awesome. And maybe Payne and McKay didn't let Galadriel and Halbrand look at the super duper important item for hours because the reveal had to happen with Theo. They had to wait till Theo got his hands on it because that's his whole thing, and they wanted to have the scene with Galadriel and Adar in the barn that sort of foreshadows and Yeah, they needed to delay it once they got the thing. And side note, just to continue with our comparison to Game of Thrones Season 8, do you remember how characters started teleporting around Westeros from scene to scene, where before the breadth and depth of Westeros' actual landmass mattered as a narrative device?
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Rings of Power gives us 4 storylines, okay? 5 if you split Bronwyn and Arendair up even further, and they all started exactly the same time because at the end of the first episode, they all watched the same comet streak across the sky, Mr. Meteor Man who totally isn't a wizard. And see, it gets weird fast because... Do you understand? Okay, I had like 2,000 words written out about how all the timelines match up, but ultimately it doesn't matter. The point is Rings of Power has some poor visual storytelling when it comes to how much time has actually passed. If you watch the Southlands story, it looks like it's only been a few days, maybe a week at most total, until we're told this at the end of episode 4.
We must have seen it in the skies a few weeks back now. Starfall.
It's been weeks, apparently, but you do not feel it. It is not there. And I combed through it, because by all visual indications, day and night, set changes, clothes, seasons, it should have maybe only been a few days at this point. Arendair is basically captured and seemingly let go the same day. It doesn't seem to take him long to travel back to Osterith. Like in Game of Thrones, you have to assume time passed invisibly in between scenes for it to have been weeks. Oh, Arendair was unconscious for several days, or maybe they were working at this exact same spot for a week, or maybe multiple days passed in between these 2 night shots right next to each other. It's not that you need to see characters traveling, you don't. It's that for 4 episodes, the viewer was left asking, shouldn't the Southlands be overrun by now? Until we get that comment. It's easy as a writer to know where your storylines are at, but you forget how a viewer is experiencing it for the first time. Again, Rings of Power faces death by 1,000 cuts. Any one of these mistakes is excusable, fine, but put them all together and the cracks are very visible. So there are all these little issues inside bigger problems with the overall direction they took the story. The weird structure, cramming all these storylines at once, the half-woods, the focus on the Southlands, rushing the rings, it's all meh. Fundamentally, the bottom line is this. None of these problems were inevitable. They didn't have to do 4 converging independent storylines. They didn't have to do the fall of Numenor as well as the rings and Sauron's resurgence and the half-woods for some reason. They didn't have to make them abandon their injured. They didn't need to do the origins of Mordor. They didn't need to do the Southlands. They didn't have to make Sauron's identity a mystery to the audience, and they didn't have to drag out the Stranger mystery. But they did. These problems are the result of a chain of conscious decisions to tell the story they did in the way they did. So, the big question becomes, who killed Rings of Mediocrity? In some sense, our story does not begin in 2022 when Rings aired, but all the way back in the year of James Blunt, in the era of Pirates of the Caribbean. In the year of our Lord, 2006, when D.B. Weiss and David Benioff approached author George R. R. Martin about adapting his sweeping fantasy epic full of blood, sex, and dragons. Like a lot of shows, Rings of Power inevitably limps along in the shadow of Game of Thrones. The behemoth made waves, it changed the industry forever and sent executives from every other studio scrambling to find their Game of Thrones, till those waves rippled their way into Smaug's little billionaire head, and in 2017 began to whisper, "Bring me Game of Thrones." And by all accounts, The Lord of the Rings of the Lord of the Rings of Power rings, was Bezos' $1 billion bet in a post-Game of Thrones world. People wanted big budget, big world building fantasy. In fact, they even gave Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series a shot, just in case that worked out any better. It didn't.
I've made billions of dollars of failures at Amazon.com.
And let's be honest, Bezos didn't do this because he had a deep love for the story and a great vision he wanted to bring to life. It's not the product of earnest experimental filmmaking the way Lord of the Rings was. His vision is one of monopolistic dominance in yet another industry he can crush unions in, not a beautiful story. Bezos wanted to make his mark. And this is because despite Amazon technically being one of the most subscribed streaming platforms, this is mostly owed to its retail service upgrade and not its programming. According to Nielsen's data in 2021, Amazon owned none of the top 10 streamed programs, only 1 of the top 10 acquired programs in Bones, only 1 of the top 10 streamed movies in The Tomorrow War, and critically, none of the top TV originals, despite pouring hundreds of millions into The Wheel of Time, The Boys, and Them. Netflix dominated virtually every field, followed by Disney and HBO, each of whom was slowly gaining a foothold in the so-called streaming war, where Amazon wasn't. In the war for IP, Amazon really hadn't landed a real hit yet, and when they're spending $1 $1 billion or 400 episodes of Breaking Bad, on some level, anything less than absolute success capable of cementing Amazon as a streaming giant is a failure. But Amazon didn't just want to capture the phenomenon of Thrones, it wanted to capture the epic money-making magic of the $3 billion grossing Lord of the Rings Jackson trilogy. This model, this IP, Amazon's money seems like a guaranteed success. Calling it the Lord of the Rings of Power is a transparent attempt to signal its connection to its much more popular brother. But more than that, Rings of Power clearly tries to buddy up to Jackson's perfect trilogy visually, taking much of their designs for the elves, dwarves, even the Balrog, connecting Gandalf to small insects and moths, which is a movie invention, initially asking Jackson to consult, hiring Howard Shore to do the opening score, and even moving the whole production to New Zealand and hiring much of the same production base like Weta Workshop or actor Jed Brophy for the orcs. An expensive choice, all to create a sense of lineage and underlying impression that this is a prequel or continuation of that vision, leaning on it for both its cultural currency and hoping to channel its financial success. One of the Stranger's only lines is even a direct nod to a line only found in the Jackson trilogy.
If you doubt, always follow your nose.
When in doubt, Eleanor Brandyford. Always follow your nose.
And the main composer, Bear McCreary, even talks explicitly about how he intends his score to create a musical lineage between Rings of Power and the Jackson trilogy.
If one day you binge the whole show, and our events unfold, and then you go to the Peter Jackson films, that you actually notice the absence of these sounds. Wait a minute, where are all those Middle Eastern colors?
Despite it being made by an entirely different company, writers and directors, Rings of Power purports to tell an entirely new story in Middle-earth. But even in the places the show took creative liberty, it tries to be more like the story you know and love. We have the lost heir to a crippled kingdom of men who doesn't want to take up the mantle, a movie invention too. In the books, Aragorn does. We have the cursed object tempting you to evil which cannot be normally destroyed. This desire to be more like Lord of the Rings even goes down to how they fundamentally conceptualize the story.
We struggled to imagine a Middle-earth story without a wizard or hobbits.
This is bizarre given Tolkien definitely didn't think that, and the Second Age is very much the story of elves and men, but it does make sense if Amazon wants an easy signal that this is just like the the magical story that you know and love. Because when people imagine Middle-earth, they think of the wizards and hobbits, they think of the Shire, they think of the Fellowship, they think of the adventure.
Tolkien is always about that journey. It has to be about good and evil and the fate of the world, or it doesn't have that epic feeling you want when you're in Tolkien.
From the beginning, we knew she couldn't do this alone. Every good quest needs a fellowship.
Rings of Power is narratively structured around giving Galadriel this journey across Middle-earth, not because this happens in the books, in the actual story, but partly to mimic the structure of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. It's meant to invoke the familiar feeling of the epic quest culminating in a huge battle, familiar images they can put into the trailer. But the story of the rings and Numenor are not journeys or quests. They're more like static court dramas of biblical proportions. They're about the corruption of these two cities that leads to war. And it's also not the heroic adventure we know Middle-earth for. It is, in so many ways, a tragedy. Tolkien's Second Age is incredibly bleak and dark and demoralizing. It's not like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. But all of this is partly why, even though Galadriel goes on a journey in Rings, she doesn't really travel. She's mostly just in one place, then suddenly another. This structure isn't naturally fit for the story they want to tell, but it is if you want to mimic the Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. It's no surprise the first season ends with a wizard and a hobbit going off on an unexpected journey into the Far East. Rings of Power is also clearly structured around being an origin story for the stuff you know from the original trilogy. The rings, of course, which is fine, but also Mithril, the Balrog, the fall of Khazad-dûm, Mordor, Mount Doom, why the elves are leaving Middle-earth, where hobbits and Gandalf and the orcs came from. These decisions were visibly made to make rings a necessary chapter in the story you already love.
What if there's a grand unification theory that connects the light of the two trees of Valinor, which went into the Silmarils, to the rings? The three elven rings were at least partially made of Mithril. It was a way to connect many parts of the canon, including the elves fading.
The series wants to be a Middle-earth theory of everything, connecting all you know and love together, explaining it, being the prequel, the first chapter you never had, so that it becomes a necessary extension of the Lord of the Rings story, even at the sacrifice of the story it purportedly wants to tell. Prioritizing Elrond, the character we already know, over Celebrimbor, the character in the actual story, speaks to that. Little of this origin stuff is naturally in the text, and given how crammed Rings is already, it suffers for it.
One of the first conversations we had with Amazon about this is the feeling that Tolkien's world was much vaster than the limited geography traversed in the Lord of the Rings books and in The Hobbit.
Yeah.
And that there are great islands to the west in Numenor at this time. There's Valinor even further west. And then east, there's an entire continent, Rhûn, that has never been visited and never explored. All we know is the stars are strange there. Part of the aspiration is to go to new parts of Tolkien's world that have never been on screen before. And this was tantalizing and exciting. The first map that was released online 5 years ago when the show was being announced has Rhûn featured prominently because of this, because we wanted to go there.
Likewise, you could say the decision to include the Southlands or Rhûn so prominently doesn't really make sense if you want to tell the story of the Rings and Numenor, but it does if Amazon wants to replicate the multi-storyline, multi-continental tale we see in Thrones, because that's what Amazon thinks people want. All of which adds to the bloat, which cripples the pacing and makes the stories feel disconnected because, well, they are. We don't know to what extent Amazon or Bezos himself determined the shape the show would eventually take, but all of the earliest conversations the writers refer to speak to this multi-continental, multi-storyline tale of converging stories that makes this world feel as big as possible, just like Thrones. And I don't think Bezos had a vision for this when he first bought the rights beyond money, but as much as Rings is a beautiful homage to the best films ever made, it also led to uninspired plotting for a story that ends up awkwardly using the original trilogy as a crutch visually and narratively, and a structure that doesn't really suit it. But the $1 billion or 500 episodes of Battlestar Galactica is also symptomatic of a deeper cancer in the industry. You know, bloated budgets for fewer and fewer projects by increasingly monopolistic companies who depend on these tentpole shows and films to make money and dominate the market, Amazon itself swallowing up MGM in 2021 for $8 billion. They look more to reliable IP and nostalgia to appeal to the widest audience possible in a world of remakes and prequels and interconnected universes. Rings of Power isn't just the most expensive television show ever made because Amazon believes in the IP, but because Bezos didn't want anyone else to have the rights, and originality is harder to sell, and Amazon needs their big show to appeal to the widest audience possible in a way that the rest of their content clearly hasn't yet, if they're to make their money back. IP is the game these days. And if all of this is feeling familiar, a company trying to make its money back by drawing you in with your love for the original trilogy, the writers trying to mimic the style of Lord of the Rings even where it doesn't necessarily fit, and this ambition to try and connect everything together and become this necessary prequel to a story you know and love, if that's reminding you of anything, it's because we've seen this mistake before, just 10 years ago.
This was the last move in a master plan. A plan long in the making.
The Hobbit is the barely 300-page children's adventure book that got me reading when I was 8. And while it was originally planned as 2 films, in 2012 Jackson announced it was being blown up into another sprawling 3-film, 9-hour fantasy epic, clearly trying to be more like its bigger brother, The Lord of the Rings. And you can feel this bloat in the films, especially in Desolation of Smaug and the Battle of Five Armies, which feature overly long fight scenes with moments from the book laboriously stretched out or dramatized with whole other plots shoved in.
Not every man's brave enough to wear a corset.
The decision to change The Hobbit like this was partly capitalistic. MGM was $5 billion in debt at the time, and 3 films did not require that much more money than 2, but generated way more. For them, this needed to be a success. Like Amazon, they wanted to recapture the epic money-making magic of the $3 billion grossing Lord of the Rings trilogy, and to do this, they also tried to more deeply connect The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, not only in terms of visuals, but structure, stakes, tropes, scope, and narrative. The Hobbit couldn't just be an adventure story about dwarves reclaiming their lost home and slaying a dragon. It must be the first battle for the fate of Middle-earth, where if the dwarves lose the Lonely Mountain, then the whole of northern Middle-earth will fall to him, and Sauron might rise again. The goblins goblins couldn't just be the goblins they annoyed earlier in the book, but of the precursor forces for Sauron who look even more competent and organized than Sauron's forces in the original trilogy. The Arkenstone isn't just a really cool stone, but the ultimate sign of royalty to unite all dwarven clans under Thorin as High King. Smaug must become this existential threat to Middle-earth who might ally with Sauron, which is really playing up an offhanded comment from Gandalf, which isn't even in The Hobbit. This is, let's call it transparent in the Battle of Five Armies trailer.
Leave Sauron to me.
Going out of its way to highlight the Lord of the Rings characters despite the tiny role they actually play in the film. Like The Hobbit wasn't allowed to be a simpler adventure story, Rings of Power isn't allowed to be a story without wizards or hobbits or a journey. The rings can't just be expressions of elvish arrogance and despair trying to preserve a world they love, but the existential salvation of the elves. Mithril, like the Arkenstone, can't just be a pretty cool metal, but it's a divine metal now. And like Rings of Power, The Hobbit structured itself as much as it could around setting up the stuff you know from Lord of the Rings. It became more about Sauron's second rise to power, about the origin of Legolas, about Saruman's decline to evil. There's the scene at the end of Battle of Five Armies where Thranduil tells Legolas to go and seek out this young ranger in the Dunedain, and it's very weird because it's so clearly manufactured to make it feel like this flows naturally into Fellowship of the Ring, when it's not in the books, and it also doesn't flow on from any of the additions they made to The Hobbit.
Go north. Find the Dunedain. There's a young ranger amongst them. You should meet him.
What is his name?
He's known in the wild as Strider. His true name, you must discover for yourself.
There's no real reason for Thranduil to say this other than,
He said it! He said it!
like Rings, The Hobbit is a grand unification theory of its own, explaining and connecting everything, structuring itself around this other story, even to its detriment. It seems like both these projects started from the assumption they have to feel as epic as The Lord of the Rings in style and composition. They have to connect themselves to this thing we know and love, and both suffered for it. But this is only half the story of how Amazon screwed themselves, because on a fundamental level, they knew right from the start that they could not do this story justice, and they still decided to go ahead with it. Because, listen to me, okay? No, I need another drink. I need another drink. All right, here we go. Raspberry vodka cruiser. You gonna mock me? You gonna type away in little comments? Yeah, don't care. Don't care. This is nice, all right? Go tippity-tappity away, I'm happy. That's all I got. Okay, so you might think that because it's called The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, that it's mostly based on the story found in this book, The Lord of the Rings. But you would be wrong. It isn't. I hear you say, what's it based on then? Well, it's mostly based on a story found in this book, The Silmarillion. Okay, then it's based on that book, I hear you say, but you would be wrong again. It isn't, because Amazon does not have the rights to this book.
We have the rights solely to the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, the Return of the King, the Appendices, and the Hobbit. And that's it. We do not have the rights to the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, or any of those other books.
And it's that little word there that you might have missed right in the middle from which Rings of Power is forged. The Appendices. Yep. Basically, at the end of The Return of the King, there's all this other stuff, including a brief summary of the stuff that happens in the Silmarillion. And they're adapting that, which I assume is going to go great for them. Hey, you know Numenor, that island kingdom of men central to our Rings of Power story? Well, it gets mentioned around 35 times in the appendices, where most of the information they have is, compared to the 200 or so times in the Silmarillion, where that story is really told, not to mention the whole other book called The Downfall of Numenor, which they also do not have the rights to. In fact, there are twice as many mentions of Numenor just in this video than there are in the entirety of the appendices. They also decided to make Galadriel the main character, even though her story is mostly found in this book, Unfinished Tales, which they also don't have the rights to. And they're doing Sauron's temporary turn to good, even though that's only found in other books too. Amazon has this little thing where they have these trivia pop-ups throughout the show. They're actually pretty cool, and one of the main ones says, most of the details and elaborations herein are derived from The Lord of the Rings, its prologue concerning hobbits, and the appendices, A through F. And let me tell you, a lot of work is being done by that word derived. Like, I don't know what to tell you, but the concerning Returning Hobbits prologue basically just says, yeah, the half-wits existed around here-ish. You might also think that because it's called The Rings of Power, then most of the story of how Sauron crafted the rings is in The Lord of the Rings or its appendices. But you would be wrong. Again, it too is only broadly summarized. Compare this passage from Fellowship of the Ring to this passage from the Silmarillion.
The elves received Sauron's aid and grew mighty in craft, whereas he learned all their secrets and betrayed them, and forged secretly in the Mountain of Fire the one ring to be their master. But Celebrimbor was aware of him, and hid the three which he had made, and there was war, and the land was laid to waste, and the gate of Moria was shut.
That's like 3 seasons of material in 64 words. Okay, so compare it to what we get in the Silmarillion. And lo, Celebrimbor made the three... Oh, I can't do it. There's literally just too much. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. We get quotes from Celebrimbor and Galadriel and Sauron, and we get their reasonings and methods. And in other stories, we get even more details, but all that is off limits. Famously, they don't have the rights to the name Anatar, the name Sauron uses when he disguises himself to the elves at Eregion. It means Lord of Gifts, meaning instead we get these totally different, not breaking copyright scenes.
Call it a gift.
Now, this isn't entirely true. The showrunners have been given access to outside materials on a, quote, case-by-case basis, like this map of Numenor, which only appears in Unfinished Tales. But this does create an ambiguity as to whether their bizarre decisions to change the lore are because they didn't have the rights, or because they decided to change it. It's like trying to adapt a book by using its Wikipedia summary, and it feels like it too. Is Ar-Pharazôn not a Caesar figure who returns from conquests and wins the heart of the people of Numenor because they don't have the rights to this particular line, or because they chose to do him this other way? Is Galadriel not seeking a kingdom of her own because they didn't get the rights, or because they thought what they had was better? We don't know. Of course, none of this meant they had to make the fundamental mistakes of the Southlands or the Half-Wits or the Wizard, or making everything a mystery, or making Sauron a hot man dude on a raft. So it's not that Payne and McKay were crippled by a lack of rights outside their control, but Amazon choosing to do this story, even though they know they don't have the rights, simultaneously destroys their ability to tell it properly for people who don't know the story, and inevitably disappoints Tolkien fans who do know it. The disappointing thing being there genuinely are a lot of stories in Middle-earth they could do, that they do have the rights to. Like there's this animated movie about the War of the Rohirrim coming out. But the stories they do have the rights to won't rival the streaming model of Game of Thrones, or have the epic money-making magic of the $3 billion grossing Lord of the Rings Jackson trilogy, and have the capacity to feel like a necessary extension of that story. They decided to do this story in spite of the lack of rights. There's also the deeper issue that the Second Age is very sparse on details, especially with the rights Amazon had. We don't know a lot about many of its key characters, Tarmiriel, Gil-galad, even Galadriel. Where Lord of the Rings lends itself naturally to a screenplay with fully formed characters, the Second Age doesn't. There's so much room for imagination that you're almost inevitably going to disappoint a large group of people. There's not a common touchstone so much of exactly the way this story should look. Which is partly on fans. We can't expect an adaptation to be just like how we imagine when info is as sparse as this, but I don't think it's as simple as that. I've listened to a lot of fan-written stories about how Rings of Power should have gone adapting this same story, and they vary wildly. And yet, even with all of this room, they still decided to do eugenics hobbits? But okay, if you have to do Numenor and the Rings in The Last Alliance, why not spend the first season with 2 storylines? One in Numenor, one in Eregion. Sauron is influencing Celebrimbor, the rise of his guild, Galadriel is slowly figuring it out and eventually gets cast out, while in Numenor we see Tarmiriel and Tar Palantir trying to navigate an increasingly volatile political environment there, where Numenor has these huge swaths of colonies on the coast, the divisions between the faithful and the kingsmen. We see the oppression of Harad, that colonial power, which culminates in Tar Palantir being forced from the throne. That seems so much more focused to me, and still lets them do what they seemingly wanted to from the start. But it doesn't have a wizard or a hobbit or a journey, and it doesn't feel like Lord of the Rings. But like, I'm no stranger to stories I love being butchered.
As you know.
And that's why I love the original trilogy so much. Lord of the Rings isn't just a beautiful film series in its own right, but it's visibly a love letter from people who deeply appreciated and understood the original story and wanted to tell it for what it was. It started with love and not a corporate cash-in. Change in an adaptation is not inherently bad. I think everyone knows this, but I've seen people defending Rings of Power saying, hey, Jackson changed a lot of stuff in his movies too, and you didn't complain then, as if the problem is like change in itself. Part of the skill of adaptation is knowing where, how, and why to change things for a new medium, for pacing, for depth, for cohesion. Where Lord of the Rings changes were made with the spirit of Lord of the Rings in mind, of course that's incredibly objective, the changes in Rings of Power were often made, I assume, 16 cruises deep and scrolling through fanfic.net.
I've made billions of dollars of failures at Amazon.com.
And Lindsay Ellis made a fantastic video essay on exactly this question, why Jackson and Boyens made the changes they did in Lord of the Rings, why they worked, and sometimes where they didn't. You know, Tom Bombadil, the Scarron of the Shire, Faramir, Denethor, Helm's Deep, Glorfindel, Arwen, what we as writers can learn from these, and what it means to make changes in the spirit of Tolkien. How does pacing change when adapting a book to a film, and what are the limitations of the medium you need to keep in mind? And it's not all pure flattery, it's about thinking critically about film and adaptations and storytelling, especially in an age where we're getting more and more of them. Some good, and some, yeah. Ellis's discussion absolutely works in with everything we've talked about this video, even if I can't discuss it here, and I cannot recommend it enough. It brings all of Lindsay Ellis's sharp and insightful analysis and shows you how to do what Rings of Power couldn't. So many of the changes Rings made have terrible ramifications for the broader story, or feel pointless or just bizarre, done without care or thought, while Lord of the Rings is not that. And you can watch it right now on Nebula at the link down in the description below, an educational streaming service I am a part of that brings together a lot of level-headed educational content under one banner, with dozens of amazing creators, which I know you'll love if you enjoy my sort of work. Lindsay's video on how they adapted The Lord of the Rings, open bracket, the good one, close brackets, is only one of many incredible documentaries of depth that are possible only because of Nebula. Genuinely, Nebula allows us to create content we were never able to before because of a broken copyright system, demonetization, finances, videos kind of like this one. It's available for just a couple of bucks a month, and that money goes to support creators, not a giant corporation. We built Nebula from the ground up, but it is important to use my link, the one in the description. I know it's tempting to just go and type it into the search bar, but using my link actually helps tell Nebula that I sent you there. That really helps me, helps this video, helps the channel, and it helps me make more long-form content. Lindsay's work absolutely does this question justice, and it feels like necessary reading in conjunction with this video, because Lord of the Rings is amazing. It was lightning in a bottle, and it has so many lessons to teach us about how to do adaptations right in a world of regurgitations and sequels and live-action adaptations more than ever before. I really do recommend watching that video at my link down in the description below. Now, despite the money-hoarding batshit fiasco of Amazon puppeteering this show into existence, we cannot lay blame for it purely at the feet of the money goblin himself. We also have to talk about the showrunners, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, described themselves as dark horse candidates when they were chosen to head up Rings of Power, and it's not hard to see why. Amazon supposedly met with industry powerhouses like the Russo brothers, responsible for much of Marvel's success, as well as Oscar-winning writers like New Zealander Anthony McCartan. Payne and McKay, on the other hand, had nothing! An uncredited writing role in Star Trek Beyond, which was good, apparently. I've never seen it, let me know.
We had reached a point, we've been writing movies for 10 years that should have gotten made, movies where the director was right, the cast was right, the script was right, the title was right, and it was a big IP, and it still wasn't happening. So we thought maybe we should try this TV thing.
And thus, by declaration of the money goblin himself, Payne and McKay ended up as first-time showrunners at the head of the most expensive television show ever made, with Amazon's cyberpunk dystopia monopolistic dreams riding on their shoulders. And hey, this could work, right? See, D.B. Weiss and David Benioff were also basically new writers when they took on Game of Thrones. And gotta give them credit, they created some of the best television ever made, bar...
While Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
But unfortunately, not only is this story much harder to adapt, but Payne and McKay are not Weiss and Benioff. They're just not that good.
I've made billions of dollars of failures.
Because in so many ways, the mistakes of Rings of Power feel like the mistakes we all make as writers when we're learning. Biting off more than you can chew, underestimating how long it'll take to develop a conflict or for people to get attached to your characters, things sounding good on paper but not in reality. A sprawling tale of several storylines from Numenor to Rhûn to Mordor to Lindon to Region sounds fantastic when you sell it to Amazon, but how do you actually connect those stories organically without crippling the pacing? Pacing is really hard to feel in your own work. It might feel fast to you because you know where it's going, but it might actually be really slow for the reader. How many times have you written something into your plan and then only realize later, perhaps as you're halfway through the story, that it doesn't quite land the way you want, or maybe you needed a totally different setup, but changing the setup affects too many other things, so you don't. Episode 8 feels like that they really wanted this Southlands storyline, but only realized later, how do we get Halbrand to Eregion? This feels like a textbook example of writing yourself into a corner and choosing to awkwardly cut your way out rather than change the setup. And it's easy for me as a novelist to change my story, I'm the only one involved, but television gives a huge amount of power to actors and directors, and it's not always easy to see how they're going to visualize it. And whether that's going to work with your words, and reshoots and rewrites, especially late in the process, are costly. So many issues feel like they don't have a great grasp of pacing or plotting or dealing with a large cast of characters. Practice with this kind of story, so you're relying too much on telling instead of showing because you're cramming so much in and you're worried people won't really get the depth of what you're trying to communicate, so you spell it out just to make sure that they do. To me, Rings of Power went wrong, especially in ways which are hard to know how this stuff will turn out when you've never done something on this scale before. Things that most people need practice to feel and intuitively know. People mostly talk about these issues in terms of writing, but it's not just writing skills. These are television industry skills, and Payne and McKay have no experience in television, especially not streaming serialized television, the sort of which we've seen on the rise over the last decade, and it shows. Smalk himself gave Payne and McKay a virtually unlimited budget.
I've made billions and
billions. But it's easy to get lost in that ambition as a writer, to try to do everything, be everything to everyone. Sometimes it's not a lack of vision, but not a specific enough vision. And where you can see the cracks of a lack of pre-production in The Hobbit, you can see the cracks of inexperience in Rings of Power. The Hobbit stretches out too little into 9 hours, while Rings of Power crams too much into its so far 9. Although The Hobbit actually isn't that bad, because at its heart, we care about Thorin, we care about Bilbo, we care about their relationship. For all the weightless, bloated fighting, it still hurts when Thorin dies at the end. When Bilbo says to the other dwarves,
if any of you are ever passing Bag End, you are welcome anytime. Don't bother knocking.
That still means a lot. In contrast,
with our hearts even bigger than our feet.
And yet, by all accounts, everyone speaks to Payne and McKay's profound love and passion for Tolkien's world. They themselves saying the harshest criticisms, outside of the pacing and the storytelling and the writing, were the idea that they didn't care about this, that they don't love Tolkien or his world. And frankly, I do think they love Tolkien's world. I don't even think it's a question. I think it's evident in how they talk about Tolkien and his world, but also in details in the show that you might not necessarily notice.
J.D. Payne also supervised all of the text. He would say, this is like really more of a Quenya thing, and that's a Sindarin word. We should be careful.
Rings of Power is more a testament to how passion or love for a story does not always translate to adapting it well. Them having a wealth of knowledge of Tolkien's world, being able to recite his poetry, reading his letters, does not mean they have the skills to bring this story to life in a faithful and brilliant way. It's a monumental task which can go wrong in a lot of ways, and one they possibly just weren't up to skill on. You see their inexperience in the cracks of clumsy dialogue, exposition, forced metaphors, pacing, but most crucially, their overall vision for the series. Not only in the eugenics halfwits or the unlikable Southlands or the Galadriel journey, but also in their fixation on mystery.
We were concerned about a situation where the part of the audience steeped in the lore is 6 or 7 episodes ahead of the characters. If deception is an important part of the journey, we want to preserve that experience for book readers too.
The question is, why? Reading the books should put you ahead of the story. Well, their fixation on mystery making a story better or being a defining part of that vision may have come from their work with this guy, who is partially responsible for
somehow Palpatine returned.
J.J. Abrams. He even put in a good word to help them get the job with Amazon, but more importantly, he pioneered what you might know as mystery box storytelling.
I realized that mystery is the catalyst for imagination. Now, it's not
the most groundbreaking idea.
It's a narrative structure built around intentionally and strategically introducing questions and mysteries to keep people engaged. Think Fringe, Cloverfield, Westworld. It can work, but it's also used to describe stories which 1. Turn things into mysteries unnecessarily, 2. Depend on baiting you with mystery and cliffhangers, and 3. End up giving disappointing or irrelevant answers. The problems of which you can see in Lost and the latter seasons of Westworld. But if this is the sort of storytelling they're used to, if this is their work experience, then they should have separated themselves from it, because Rings of Power is not a good execution of it. No amount of love or passion for a story will teach you how to write, will teach you how to adapt a story, where and how to make changes. That is a very different skill. But Rings of Power is also a testament to how a bad vision from the showrunners at its foundation will destroy a story no matter how good your writers are, because Rings of Power did have a team of competent writers. Jennifer Hutchinson, which you might know for her work on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, she's one of the writers. Jason Cahill, partly responsible for The Sopranos and Fringe, Stephen Folsom, Toy Story 4, Justin Doble produced Stranger Things, but it doesn't matter if you put Aaron Sorkin behind a Sharknado script, it's still Sharknado. It doesn't matter if you have Jennifer Hutchinson behind the Eugenics Hobbits, you still have Eugenics Hobbits. Even if their dialogue and exposition and metaphors were great, structuring the story around 4 disconnected storylines, one of which doesn't start till episode 3, one of which is virtually irrelevant, and dragging them all out as mysteries until the final episode was still a bad idea. And the thing is, Payne and McKay do seem aware that they're still learning as writers. When asked what they learned from making season 1, they said,
"That could be an answer that takes an hour. The entire making of the show has been a massive learning experience for everyone involved. We had no idea what we were getting into. No one else did either. There are things that didn't work as well in season 1 that might have worked in a smaller show."
They even admitted the first episodes were weaker than what they had hoped. But this is what we do as writers. We critique and we learn and we grow and we fail, and first seasons are often much rougher than the later ones. Payne and McKay are just doing all of this as the flagship enterprise of one of the largest and most powerful companies in the world, with their failures on a $1 billion stage with one of the world's most beloved IPs. And that's rough. If these mistakes were made with a smaller story, I think people would understand more. My last 6 years of work is open on the internet for people to see, and in that time, I've grown immensely as a writer and creator. Hey, Subfuries!
Kill it! Kill it with fire!
And yeah, it sucks when I know people are judging me for work I did when I was very much still learning. But at the same time, people really didn't expect much of me when I was starting out. I'm on YouTube.
Larry, I'm on DuckTales.
Maybe they should have never been at the helm of this series in the first place. But I have some sympathy for writers who are creating on this level with this high expectations, even if it means they mishandled something I love so dearly. Even for all the crippling mistakes the series has, they are, on some level, just mistakes another writer has made. There's been this ugly rise in people painting bad stories as the product of evil people who hate the source material and hate fans. Not only is this an incredibly poor and emotional way to understand media, but it's almost never true. Rings of Power's flaws are much better explained by a monopolistic company trying to stab its way into streaming relevancy, and showrunners with an ambitious vision, but not the skills to execute it. Because you can feel that passion and love for Tolkien in some truly inspired creative decisions throughout Rings. The opening credits uses cymatics. You've probably seen it before, where people create shapes by moving flour or sand with vibrations to create these beautiful patterns. The shapes changing depending on the sounds you use. The credits move through Tolkien's mythology, from the Two Trees of Eleanor to Fëanor's Star to the Three Silmarils, Morgoth, foreshadowing the Rings of Power to come. But more than just referencing events of the Silmarillion, this choice to use cymatics is fundamentally Tolkienian. Arda, Tolkien's world, is sung into existence in the Ainulindale, Howard Shore's choral music here thematically creating the events depicted in the shifting stones. The power of music, but also art indirectly, is a constant theme in Tolkien's work. It appears in the stories of Beren and Luthien, Fëanor. Elvish music itself can change the world around them. It can affect others. Magic is this natural expression of creativity, of the good in the world, and famously, the evil forces of Tolkien's world cannot create, they can only corrupt, and that's what we see here in the opening credits. This opening is simply inspired, it's visually evocative, and it elevates the source material in ways you might not even necessarily notice. And this isn't a passing reference, an inconsequential nod to placate Tolkien fans. In episode 4, some dwarven miners are trapped in a tunnel, and Deezer sings to the rocks, pleading for them to be freed.
was that?
It was a plea to the rocks to release the bodies of the miners with breath still inside them.
This theme is deeply integrated into the story in one of the best scenes in the show in an episode Payne and McKay themselves wrote. That to me sounds like they understand.
Music is so important in Tolkien. Music created the universe in Tolkien. Songs are throughout the books.
And in Tolkien in general, things can be both. They can be sort of sad, haunting, but also beautiful. And the idea of having to be migratory and always leaving something behind feels just classically Tolkienian, because Tolkien is filled with journeys, and every journey means heading to somewhere new, but also leaving somewhere old. And the idea that Harfoots have to go through that so often that they would have a song that captured that feeling of, I trade all I've known for the unknown ahead.
This is talking about the Wandering Day song sung a couple of episodes later. It's a reference to the Not All Those Who Wander Are Lost poem, and what they say here does speak to their understanding of Tolkien's writing. Bilbo and Frodo both go away on great journeys, but inevitably return different people. In many ways, they find themselves isolated from the life they knew. They left something behind in their journey. And with how much characters break out into song in Tolkien's books, you'd think he was writing a stage musical. Again, the broader decision of eugenics hobbits is bad, but decisions like this are beautiful and Tolkienian. Bear McCreary, the composer for most of the music in Rings, put a huge amount of time and love and thought into a score that rivals the depth of Howard Shore in Lord of the Rings.
So I'm using balafons along with Celtic bagpipes and penny whistle to create this very folky, warm, inviting feeling of a music that's moving forward. The Harfoot music should feel like we're on the move.
He too emphasizes the importance of choral work in Tolkien's own mythology, and it should come as no surprise that of the 10 real awards Rings of Power won, over a third of them were for Bear McCreary's score. And on a fundamental level, Payne and McKay very deliberately chose to tackle Tolkien's themes with Adar and the Orcs.
As worthy of the breath of life, and just as worthy of a home.
Tolkien went through numerous origins for his orcs as he became increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of an irredeemably evil race of inherently bad people. For a man whose religious ethics revolved around redemption and forgiveness and the inherent value of life, this was wrong. Tolkien himself described his work as, quote, fundamentally Catholic, pointing to Bilbo and Frodo showing mercy to Gollum as two of the most existentially important events in his world. Not battles, not death, but mercy. Fans have long pointed to scenes in Lord of the Rings where orcs exhibit traits of camaraderie, rebellion, friendship, loyalty, and even Tolkien describes them as evil, but not more evil than humans alive in his day. He increasingly gave them their own morality, free will, and if that's the case, his theology required they deserved mercy where possible too. Rings of Power chose to make this a central question in Galadriel's desire for vengeance. There's a reason this is the opening line to Rings of Power.
Nothing is evil in the beginning.
Like Frodo or Bilbo showing mercy to Gollum, Galadriel showing mercy to Adar is the central, pivotal moment in the series. To Tolkien, though war may be necessary, it is never a good thing to kill, and you have a moral duty to show mercy where you can. And Galadriel's arc is about realizing that, yeah, she's been killing people because she wants to, not because she needs to. That line from the beginning goes on to say nothing was evil in the beginning, not even Sauron was so. And yeah, Tolkien writes about a time Sauron tried to repent in the Second Age.
Sauron was, of course, not evil in origin. His temporary turn to good and benevolence ended in even greater relapse. He was not indeed wholly evil. Not unless all reformers who want to hurry up with reconstruction and reorganization are wholly evil, even before pride and the lust to exert their will eat them up.
The central conflict is in how Galadriel and Halbrand speak of forgiving themselves and each other, of redemption no matter how far each of them have gone, not unlike Boromir. And if this doesn't feel Tolkienian to you, then I want to read you a line from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. There is no one, however wicked and guilty, who may not confidently hope for forgiveness, provided his repentance is honest. I'm not sure there is anything more fundamentally Catholic or Tolkienian. What greater love is there than love shown to an enemy gone so far down the path of darkness they themselves are unsure there is any light behind them at all? This is not to say they don't handle some of the other themes in the series a bit more clumsily and muddily. Would Tolkien have believed you need to, quote, touch the darkness to know what is right? I don't know about that. To Tolkien, the right thing might be an uncompromising clear line in the sand. Though you could argue characters like Boromir had to touch the darkness to know they were doing wrong. They were taken so far by temptation or vengeance in Galadriel's case that only after crossing that line did they manage to really see what they were doing wrong and correct themselves. And I know Tolkien has a reputation for writing good and evil characters, but if you actually dig into the Legendarium, there's a decent amount of grey area of characters trying to figure out what the right thing is to do. And that love and understanding of Tolkien's world can be seen in the 2,000 other people who also worked on Rings of Power. Actors, writers, directors, costume designers, VFX artists, concept artists, each of whom brought their own passion and love to the series. In an era of over-reliance on CGI, Rings of Power is a breath of fresh air. Over 38,000 pieces of concept art were produced, let alone the real swords, bows, and sets. Rings of Power invested in extended pre-production period, allowing them to carefully design and plan ahead artistically and creatively, which a lot of projects do not these days, and you can see that.
It was really important to me to make sure that with elves, if we're going to change the elves from a world where they were living entirely in forests in Lindon, and wanting to then say how they would live in a more city world, that you wouldn't give up that greenery.
A stream, which is only a 2-day shoot, so a small shoot. It's a fairly wide sort of shot. We've probably got close to over 3,000 odd plants, maybe 2,800 flowers and some other perennials, all that have been grown out of season. We've also got these out-of-season daffodils, which we're slightly nervous about.
Take a look at this architectural plan for Numenor. It reportedly took 5 months to build, with bulletins full of real Numenorian history from the books. Production designer Ramsey Avery incorporated Mediterranean, Greco-Roman, and Egyptian influences, which is very much how Tolkien imagined them. It's no shock to say Smaug himself spared no expense. 2,000 other people all brought their love for this world to the series. People who, by the way, worked on the original trilogy. And it's okay for people to enjoy this series on that level. These are other art forms like writing that immerse people and make you fall in love with the world. As showrunners, Payne and McKay were deeply involved in every level of pre-production, and as much as they're responsible for the misdirection of the overall vision of the series, they're also partly responsible for this stuff. It wasn't all perfect. A lot of criticism was made of the costumes, and I want to point you to this video by Jess of the Shire, where she talks through some of the incredible costuming done by designer Kate Hawley, and some of the less impressive designs and how and why those mistakes might have been made. Or there was this marketing catastrophe. Who approved this? Fundamentally, Rings of Power is a monument to how a lot of good work and love by a lot of people can be lost when the overall vision, the structure, the very foundations of the story are wrong from the start. Lost in an overly ambitious vision of the wrong thing, lost in us not caring about the characters, lost in us getting bored because the stories aren't going anywhere, lost in mediocrity. Adaptations are meant to be an opportunity to share a story we love with people who might not otherwise see them, and it sucks when adaptations don't seem to appreciate what made the original story special. Ultimately, a lot of Tolkien fans, including me, were disappointed because Rings of Power doesn't seem to do that. I could spend hours going through all the little ways it breaks the law. The elves not waking in Middle-earth, timeline compression, Durin's reincarnation, elvish hair, blah, 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 blah. A lot of it doesn't matter, like the elves having short hair, whatever, but a lot of it was pointless, like rushing the rings, or it could have just been done so much better, like connecting the Mithril to the Silmarils.
Lightning ensnared the tree.
If Mithril had to contain the light of the Silmarils, then why not have it found beneath the Lake Middenmeer and give us a line like this? They say the lake holds the light of the stars, Eärendil's Silmaril amongst it. The light fell upon the lake and sunk deep into the earth and bore a new metal with a light of its own, an echo of your father. Not only is this less cartoonish, but it also gives a character dimension to Elrond learning about this. Mithril now contains the light of his father, but more than that, it also fits with the central metaphor of the series, the false lights in the water. False because Mithril will lead the dwarves down a dark path to their destruction, as well as the elves who are desperate to preserve their lands from decay. It is hope, but a false hope. The most divisive big change is Galadriel. Did she go and do anything we see in the series? Not really, but Tolkien also didn't really write a huge amount about Galadriel here, and he wasn't finished with her story when he died. She was a relatively late addition to the mythology, and the older he got, the more pivotal she became.
There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, and it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions. or to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings.
There is no single canon Galadriel, there are many. They do have things in common. She's wise and experienced, but also hungry for power, for a kingdom of her own, but also solemn about the loss of everything she's ever known. I absolutely adore this passage about her. I am grieved in Middle-earth, for leaves fall and flowers fade that I have loved, so that the land of my dwelling is filled with regret no spring can redress. How otherwise can it be for the Eldar, if they cling to Middle-earth, said Celebrimbor. Will you then pass over the sea? Nay, she said. Angrod is gone, Aegnor is gone, and Felagund is no more. Of Finarfin's children I am the last, but my heart is still proud. What did the golden house of Finarfin do that I should ask the pardon of the Valar, or be content in an isle on the sea whose native land was Aman the Blessed? Here I am mightier. What would you do then? Said Celebrimbor. I would have trees and grass about me that do not die. Here in a land that is mine, must then Middle-earth fade and perish forever? What a fascinating character. But guess what? They don't have the rights to that either. That passage is in Unfinished Tales. In some versions, she's even banned by the Valar from returning to Valinor because of her role in the rebellion against them, leaving for Middle-earth to rule lands of her own. What she is not is
what the elf means.
Then if blood be the price of passage, I will pay it. But one way or another, I will depart.
I welcome you to try.
I have no need of your welcome.
Queen's Court isn't exactly your usual battlefield, is it? You do well to identify what it is that your opponent most fears.
And exploit it.
That would leave me little choice but to shout for your minders.
Suppose the words never manage to escape your throat.
Did you need to write it so she threatens Elendil like that here? To me, it sounds like Tolkien just wrote a more interesting version of what they kind of already tried to do. She is mourning the loss of her family. She is determined to keep Sauron at bay. She is strong and powerful, and she is naive in her own way. But without this infantile stuff that makes you dislike her in a way the writers clearly did not intend. Remember how the most important way you can critique someone's work is understanding what they were trying to accomplish and measuring it against that?
The recklessness that she has, like, emotionally is also kind of physical. She's scrappier than some of the elves at the beginning because she's losing her connection to what makes you an elf. The elegance and regalness of the elf.
Sure, but we don't really get the impression she's losing her connection to what makes her an elf or who she really is. The prologue gives us the sense she's always been this kind of rough and tumble first resort to violence person, not quite regal and elegant. The messaging of her losing herself in violence would hit a lot harder if we saw her joy and elegance before she lost Finrod. A sense of who she was beforehand, but also foreshadowing who she will become again. It's not an issue to have unlikable characters unless you want us to root for them and care about them, and every single time the writers talk about Galadriel, it's clear that's what they wanted. I'm not focusing much on the lore changes, because being different to the source material can make it a poor adaptation, but it doesn't mean it's inherently poorly written. But I think it does speak to the apathy surrounding the series from fans. But fine, if all of these mistakes ultimately began with Amazon trying to channel Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings' success and cement themselves as a prestige streaming giant, did it work? Was it worth $1 billion? Was it worth butchering a story I love? As far as Amazon is officially concerned, it's a profound success, the likes of which they've never seen before. And sure, Rings of Power did top the charts for weeks at a time with millions of viewers, there's no denying that. Amazon is sinking more money into it with a second and third season already in pre-production, which says something, and it has 83% on Rotten Tomatoes. Somehow. But the number getting thrown around a lot is 37%. Rings of Power was a massive flop that only 37% of viewers finished Amazon's Rings of Power addresses negative viewership of only 37% of people who started Lord of the Rings ever finished it. And I was skeptical at first. Is this just sensational headlines? Is it really that bad? I don't finish a lot of shows that I start. So I reached out to a Netflix exec I know and asked what sort of percentage they'd be looking for, and they said, yeah, It's bad. They'd be looking for 50%, and that would be okay. Now, 37% isn't the whole story. It actually goes up to 45% when it includes viewers outside the US, but that is still below the threshold. It's still below what Amazon wanted, reflects how boring the show is, and it has done little to shift Amazon's position in the streaming wars. In 2022, after Rings of Power aired, they owned none of the top streaming programs, only one of the top acquired programs in SpongeBob SquarePants, dropping completely off the top movies, and while Rings of Power did reach the top list of streaming originals, it only came in at 15th, with shows with a similar runtime like Wednesday, Dharma, or Inventing Anna, which I had never even heard of until making this video, but apparently it's really popular.
I do not have time for this. I do not have time for you.
Shows like that outperforming Rings up to 2 times over. Despite coming out late in the year, Rings of Power dropped off the list of most streaming programs completely in 2023 as well, with only Amazon's Jack Ryan series making the list, despite Amazon releasing more series and sinking more money than ever that year. Is this really the everyone's talking about it water cooler show Mr. Moneybag Smaug himself clearly wanted Rings of Power to be? Well, AO3, a fanfiction site and the only objective measure, only features 1,700 pieces of fanfiction for Rings compared to House of the Dragon's 17,000, despite it airing at the same time, kind of giving you an idea of what people are thinking and talking about this long after, though House of the Dragon is 10 times hornier. On Instagram, there's not huge swaths of people cosplaying as the characters from Rings of Power, though there is this amazing cosplay from Lauren Does Cosplay, really love that. I actually do love Galadriel's armor. The Reddit and Facebook pages for Rings of Power just aren't that big or active, and inside Tolkien communities, honestly, Rings of Power just isn't talked about that much beyond, oh yeah, that happened. It's not that there's no community around it, but that it's just clearly not the powerhouse water cooler show Amazon clearly wanted it to be. It might be in future seasons. Sometimes they become like that. Breaking Bad really didn't take off till the later seasons. We're just not there yet. The disappointing and frustrating thing being that they could have, one, made a show so much more faithful to the source material for so much less money and had a dedicated Tolkien audience scrambling for more. Or two, made it better by being more faithful in what are really obviously simple ways a lot of the time. And it could have been that water cooler show maybe. But they didn't. Honestly, at this point, I'm kind of sorry for Bezos himself.
I've made billions of dollars of failures at Amazon.com.
That moment of sympathy passed. And yet, even with all of these issues, most of the show is just fine, full stop. A lot of these issues are relatively small. Most people don't sit there thinking, oh, this is mystery box storytelling, or think about how forced it is for Halbrand to end up wounded and injured and how he gets from the Southlands to Eregion, or about clumsy metaphors. Most people watch and enjoy CW shows like Supernatural or watch The Grey Man, and then they move on. They probably wouldn't care as much if it didn't cost $1 billion. People are going to watch Rings and go, oh, it's slow, it's boring, it's a disappointment for a show that cost Bezos' left testicle. It's not nearly as interesting, apparently, as Netflix's Love is Blind, which attracted 4 billion more minutes. None of these flaws make Rings of Power the worst thing ever made, or anywhere close to that. It's just a mediocre thing that was made, and on 1/10 of its budget, it wouldn't even be surprising. And I don't think there's any better way to end a video about Rings of Power, our love for Tolkien, than a quote from the professor himself. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend.
You say, take me on a treasure hunt. I long for something new. Have you heard the fairies when they sing and dance? Oh, I wish it was me every night. When I close my eyes, I see trust you when you say that beauty lives in me too. Later it comes later, dear, for many of us. You that we learn through the wrong. Bye.